Our first story comes from someone who experienced something that still haunts them years later. I need to share what happened to me 3 years ago, because I still can't make sense of it. I was driving home from work on a Tuesday evening, taking the same route I'd taken hundreds of times before. It's a straight highway with very few turns, and I know every landmark by heart. About halfway through my commute, I passed the old red barn that sits about 2 miles before my exit. I always use it as a mental checkpoint, because once I see that barn, I know I'm almost home. But that night, something was wrong. I kept driving and driving, waiting for my exit to appear, but it never came. The highway just stretched endlessly ahead of me, and I started to panic. I'd been driving for what felt like an hour past where my exit should have been, but my gas gauge hadn't moved at all. The digital clock on my dashboard was stuck at 6:47 p.m, the exact time I'd passed the red barn. I pulled over at a rest stop that I'd never seen before, even though I'd driven this route countless times. The parking lot was completely empty except for my car, and the building looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The windows were boarded up, and weeds were growing through cracks in the concrete. But the strangest part was that all the streetlights were on, casting this eerie orange glow over everything, even though it was still daylight. I tried calling my wife to tell her I was going to be late, but my phone had no signal. Not even one bar, which was impossible because this highway has excellent coverage. I sat in my car for what felt like 20 minutes, trying to figure out what was happening. The silence was absolute. No cars passing by, no birds, no wind, nothing. It was like the world had been put on pause. Finally, I decided to turn around and head back the way I came. As soon as I pulled back onto the highway, everything snapped back to normal. Cars appeared on the road around me, my phone suddenly had full signal, and my clock jumped from 6:47 to 7:23 in an instant. Within 5 minutes, I saw my exit and took it home like nothing had happened. When I got home, my wife asked why I was late. I told her about the traffic, but when I checked my phone, there were no missed calls or texts from her. According to her, I'd arrived home at exactly the same time I always did. She had no memory of me being late at all. I've driven that route hundreds of times since then, and I've never seen that rest stop again. I've looked for it on maps, asked other commuters, even contacted the highway department. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. The weirdest part is that my car's odometer showed I'd driven the exact same number of miles I always did for that trip, as if those extra hours of driving never happened. That story ends there. The idea of being trapped in some kind of temporal loop on a familiar highway is absolutely terrifying. It's like reality just glitched, and he got caught in a pocket of space-time that shouldn't exist. The fact that his wife had no memory of him being late makes it even more unsettling, like he slipped into an alternate version of his commute and somehow found his way back. Time anomalies like this are some of the most disturbing glitches people report because they mess with something we consider completely reliable. Let's move to our next story, which involves a childhood memory that took a very strange turn. When I was 8 years old, I had an imaginary friend named Oliver. He was completely real to me, and I would spend hours talking to him and playing games in my bedroom. My parents thought it was cute and normal childhood behaviour, so they never discouraged it. Oliver had very specific characteristics that I remember clearly. He had messy brown hair, wore a blue striped shirt, and always carried around a small wooden toy airplane. This went on for about 6 months until my parents decided to redecorate my room. While we were moving furniture, my mum found an old photograph wedged behind my dresser. It was a school photo from the 1970s, based on the clothing and hairstyle. The boy in the photo looked exactly like Oliver, down to the messy brown hair and blue striped shirt. Even more disturbing, he was holding the same wooden airplane I'd always imagined Oliver carrying. My parents were confused about where the photo had come from. We'd only lived in the house for 2 years, and the previous owners had moved to Florida and taken all their belongings. My mum called them to ask about the photograph, and they told her something that made everyone uncomfortable. Their son had lived in my bedroom until he died in a car accident in 1978. His name was Oliver, and he'd been 8 years old when he passed away. The family sent us more photos of Oliver, and every single detail matched my imaginary friend perfectly. The way he styled his hair, his favourite shirt, even the wooden airplane that had been his most treasured toy. They'd left that photograph behind by accident when they moved, wedged behind furniture where nobody would think to look. After we found the photo, Oliver stopped visiting me. I would sit in my room waiting for him to appear, but he never did. It was like discovering his real identity had somehow broken whatever connection we'd shared. My parents put the photograph in a frame and set it on my dresser, thinking it might bring me comfort, but it just made me sad. Years later, when I was in high school, I learned more about the house's history. Oliver's family had lived there for over 20 years, and his bedroom had been exactly where mine was. According to neighbours who remembered him, Oliver had been a lonely child who spent most of his time playing alone in his room because he had trouble making friends at school. I'm 32 now, and I still think about Oliver sometimes. I wonder if he was actually trying to communicate with me, or if somehow I was picking up on residual memories left in that room. The timing seems too perfect to be coincidence. A lonely child who died young, reaching out to another lonely child who needed a friend. We moved out of that house when I was 12, but I drove by it a few years ago. The new owners had completely renovated the outside, but I could still see my old bedroom window on the second floor. I sat in my car wondering if Oliver was still there, waiting for another 8-year-old to befriend. That story is finished. The connection between an imaginary friend and a deceased child who lived in the same room is absolutely chilling. What makes it even more compelling is how specific the details were, down to the wooden airplane that no living person could have known about. It raises so many questions about whether consciousness can somehow imprint itself on physical spaces, especially when trauma or strong emotions are involved. The fact that Oliver stopped appearing once the truth was discovered suggests there was definitely something supernatural happening beyond normal childhood imagination. Our next story takes us into territory that will make you question everything you think you know about time and memory. Last month, I experienced something that completely shattered my understanding of reality. I was at my local coffee shop, a place I visit almost every morning before work. It's a small independent place that's been in the same location for over 15 years. I know the layout by heart, I recognise all the regular customers, and I'm friendly with most of the staff. But that Tuesday morning, everything was different. The moment I walked in, I noticed the walls were painted a soft yellow instead of the usual dark green. The furniture was arranged completely differently, with the counter moved to the opposite wall and tables in configurations I'd never seen before. Even the menu board looked different, featuring drinks and pastries that weren't typically available. I approached the counter, confused but trying to act normal. The barista was a woman I'd never seen before, probably in her 50s with grey hair and a warm smile. She greeted me cheerfully and asked what I could get for me. I ordered my usual medium coffee with cream, but she looked puzzled and said they didn't serve coffee in medium sizes, only small and large. This was strange because I'd ordered a medium coffee from this exact shop hundreds of times. I adjusted my order and asked for a large instead. While she prepared it, I looked around the shop more carefully. Not only was everything arranged differently, but there were customers I didn't recognise at all. In a small neighbourhood coffee shop, you start to know the regulars, but every single person was a complete stranger. The barista handed me my coffee and said, "That'll be $4.50. I was shocked because my usual order never cost more than $3. When I mentioned this seemed expensive, she smiled and said they'd actually lowered their prices recently, and that coffee used to cost over $5. I paid and found a table, trying to make sense of what was happening. I pulled out my phone to check if I'd somehow gone to the wrong coffee shop, but the GPS confirmed I was at the correct address. I even checked the shop's website, and everything matched what I was seeing. The yellow walls, the menu prices, even a photo of the grey-haired barista I'd never seen before. After finishing my coffee, I left feeling completely disoriented. I came back the next morning, and everything was back to normal. Green walls, familiar layout, the usual barista who greeted me by name and asked if I wanted my regular medium coffee. When I mentioned the previous day's experience, she looked at me strangely and said she'd worked every shift that week and had definitely seen me Tuesday morning, just like always. I asked her about the grey-haired woman, the yellow walls and the different prices. She had no idea what I was talking about. According to her and the other staff members, nothing about the shop had changed in months. They even showed me photos from their social media account, proving the shop had looked the same for years. The most unsettling part was when I checked my bank statement. It showed the $4.50 charge from Tuesday morning, even though everyone insisted I'd paid my usual $3. The receipt in my wallet showed the higher price and was signed by someone named Margaret, but none of the staff had ever heard of anyone by that name working there. That story ends there. Stepping into what appears to be an alternate version of a familiar place is one of the most disorienting experiences imaginable. It's like reality briefly shuffled him into a parallel dimension where small details were different, but the fundamental location remained the same. The fact that his bank statement reflected the higher price proves something genuinely inexplicable happened, even if nobody else remembers it. These kinds of dimensional slip experiences make you wonder how many different versions of reality might exist simultaneously. Let's move into our next story, which involves a family photograph that revealed something impossible. My grandmother passed away last year, and while cleaning out her house, we found dozens of old photo albums she'd kept throughout her life. Most of them contained typical family pictures, from holidays, birthdays, and special occasions spanning several decades. But there was one album that confused everyone in our family. The album was labelled Family Reunions 1985 to 2010 in my grandmother's handwriting. As we flipped through the pages, we saw photos from gatherings I remembered attending. There were pictures of cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends at various barbecues and holiday celebrations. Everything seemed normal until we reached a page from what appeared to be a reunion from 1997. In one of the photographs, clearly taken at my aunt's house during our annual 4th of July barbecue, there was a person sitting at the picnic table who didn't belong. It was me, but that was impossible because I wasn't born until 2001. The person in the photo looked exactly like me at around age 12 or 13, wearing clothes I remembered owning and sitting between my cousins, who were much younger in the picture than they should have been. My mother was standing behind me in the photo with her hand on my shoulder, smiling at the camera. She looked exactly as she did in other 1997 photos, but I was somehow there too, 4 years before I existed. The weird part was that everyone else in the photo was the appropriate age for 1997, but I appeared to be my normal age from around 2013. We showed the photo to other family members, and nobody could explain it. My aunt, who hosted that barbecue, insisted I had never attended any family gatherings before 2002, which was obviously true since I didn't exist. But there I was in the photo, clear as day, looking completely natural and comfortable among relatives who should have been much older when I actually met them. The photograph itself seemed authentic. It had the same quality and colour saturation as other pictures from that era, and it was printed on the same photo paper my grandmother always used. There were no signs of digital manipulation or double exposure. More importantly, this was years before photo editing software became accessible to regular people, like my grandmother. We found 2 other photographs from different years showing the same impossible situation. One from 1994 showed me at what appeared to be my grandfather's birthday party, and another from 1999 showed me playing in the backyard with cousins during a summer cookout. In all of these photos, I looked exactly the same age, while everyone else appeared appropriately younger. My mother was particularly disturbed by the photos because she remembered those specific events clearly, but she had no memory of me being there. According to her, I was definitely not present at any family gatherings before I was born, which seems obvious but needed to be stated given what we were seeing. The most unsettling discovery was when we found my grandmother's old guest lists for family reunions. Written in her meticulous handwriting, my name appeared on lists from 1994, 1997, and 1999, along with notes about what food I liked and reminders to save me a piece of cake. She had apparently been planning around my presence at events that occurred before my birth. We asked my grandmother about this before she passed, but she was already dealing with memory issues and couldn't explain the photographs. She just smiled and said she was glad I'd been able to attend so many family gatherings over the years. When we pressed for details, she became confused and couldn't understand why we were asking such strange questions about normal family photos. That story concludes right there. The idea of appearing in family photographs from before you were born touches on some deep questions about the nature of time and identity. It's not just a simple case of mistaken identity or photo manipulation, especially given that this was documented across multiple years with corresponding guest lists in his grandmother's handwriting. The fact that he appeared the same age in photos spanning several years, while everyone else aged normally, suggests something far more complex than a simple glitch. It makes you wonder if consciousness or identity can somehow exist independently of linear time. Our next story involves a workplace encounter that defied all logical explanation and left lasting questions about the nature of reality itself. I work as a security guard at a large corporate office building downtown. It's mostly routine work, checking badges, monitoring cameras, and doing occasional patrols through the floors. The building has been my assignment for 3 years, and I know every hallway, elevator, and office space like the back of my hand. Last Thursday night, I was working the graveyard shift when something happened that I still can't explain. Around 2 a.m, I was making my usual rounds on the 15th floor when I heard typing coming from one of the offices. This was strange because the building should have been completely empty except for me and the cleaning crew, who had already finished that floor hours earlier. I followed the sound to office 1547, which belongs to a woman named Patricia, who works in accounting. Through the glass door, I could see someone sitting at her desk, typing on the computer. The figure was wearing a dark business suit and appeared to be working intently on something important. I knocked on the door and called out, asking if everything was okay. The person looked up at me, and I realized it was Patricia herself. She seemed surprised to see me and explained that she'd stayed late to finish a project that was due first thing in the morning. She apologized for not checking in with security and said she'd be leaving within the hour. This seemed reasonable enough, so I continued my patrol. But something bothered me about the encounter. Patricia had looked exactly the same as always, but there was something off about her mannerisms. She seemed more formal than usual, and her voice sounded different somehow, more professional and distant than the friendly woman I'd chatted with many times before. About 30 minutes later, I decided to check on her again, to make sure she was okay working so late. When I got to office 1547, it was completely dark and empty. I used my master key to unlock the door and look around. The computer was turned off. There were no signs anyone had been working there, and Patricia's usual personal items were arranged exactly as she always left them at the end of the day. I checked the security logs to see when Patricia had badged out of the building, and according to our system, she'd left at 5:47 p.m, just like she did every weekday. There was no record of her returning to the building, and our cameras showed no one entering or leaving office 1547 during my shift. The next morning, I asked Patricia about staying late the previous night. She looked at me confused and said she'd gone straight home after work, had dinner with her family, and been in bed by 10 p.m. She had no memory of working late or seeing me in her office. When I described our conversation in detail, she became concerned and asked if I was feeling all right. I pulled up the security footage from the 15th floor camera that covers the hallway outside her office. The video clearly showed me walking up to her door at 2:03 a.m, standing there for several minutes, and having what appeared to be a conversation with someone inside. But the camera angle couldn't capture the interior of the office, so there was no way to prove what I'd seen. The strangest part was discovering that Patricia had indeed finished the project she mentioned working on. When she arrived at work that morning, the report was completed and saved on her computer with a timestamp of 2:24 a.m. But Patricia insisted she'd finished it before leaving the previous evening and had no explanation for the timestamp discrepancy. I've worked security for over a decade, and I've never experienced anything like this. I know what I saw, and I know Patricia was in that office working at 2 a.m, but according to every piece of evidence except my own memory, she was never there at all. That story ends there. Working security overnight can mess with your perception, but having a full conversation with someone who supposedly wasn't there is beyond any normal explanation. The fact that the work was actually completed with a timestamp matching when he saw her makes it even more bizarre. It's like he witnessed some kind of echo or impression of Patricia's consciousness, completing tasks while her physical body was safely at home sleeping. Here's our next story about a childhood home that held secrets no one could have predicted. I grew up in a house that my parents bought when I was 5 years old. It was a typical suburban home built in the 1960s with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a finished basement that became my playroom. I lived there until I graduated high school and moved away for college, so I knew every inch of that house intimately. About 10 years after I moved out, my parents decided to renovate the basement to create a home office for my father's retirement. During the demolition, they discovered something that shouldn't have existed. Behind the panelled walls, they found a fully furnished room that none of us had ever known was there. The hidden room was about 12 feet by 10 feet, with its own electrical outlets and overhead lighting. It contained a small desk, a bookshelf filled with children's books, several toys that looked like they were from the 1970s, and a twin bed with sheets that appeared to have been recently used. The air smelled stale, but not musty, like the room had been sealed but not abandoned. What made this discovery truly unsettling was that I remembered playing in this exact room as a child. Not the basement playroom where I actually spent my time, but this hidden space that supposedly didn't exist. I had vivid memories of reading those specific books, playing with those toys, and sometimes taking naps on that small bed. I even remembered the way the light from the single window created patterns on the wall during afternoon hours. My parents were baffled because they'd lived in the house for over 20 years and had no knowledge of this room. The original blueprints they'd received when purchasing the house showed no indication of additional space in the basement. They contacted the previous owners, who insisted they'd never known about any hidden room and had certainly never furnished one as a child's play area. The construction of the room was professional and appeared to be original to the house. The walls were properly insulated, the electrical work was up to code, and everything seemed to have been built at the same time as the rest of the basement. But somehow, this fully functional room had existed behind a wall for decades, without anyone knowing about it. The children's books in the room were particularly strange. They were titles I remembered reading, but they were editions that had been published before my family moved into the house. Some of them had inscriptions written in a child's handwriting that looked remarkably similar to my own penmanship from that age, but the dates were from years before we lived there. My parents showed me photos of the room, and I experienced this overwhelming sense of nostalgia and familiarity. I could describe details about the space that weren't visible in the pictures, like how the desk drawer stuck slightly when you tried to open it, or how the bookshelf wobbled if you leaned against it. These weren't things I could have guessed or imagined. The most disturbing discovery was a journal hidden under the mattress. The entries were written in a child's handwriting and described daily activities, family interactions, and school experiences that matched my own childhood memories perfectly. But the dates in the journal were from 1978 to 1985, and I wasn't born until 1983. We never found any explanation for the room or how I could have memories of playing in a space that was supposedly sealed behind a wall. My parents eventually converted it into part of the home office, but they kept some of the books and toys, thinking they might have sentimental value for reasons none of us understood. To this day, I can close my eyes and perfectly visualize that hidden room. I remember the feeling of sunlight coming through the window, the smell of the old books, and the comfort of that small bed during afternoon naps. But according to everyone involved, I should have no memory of that space at all. That story ends there. Discovering a hidden room filled with your own childhood memories from before you lived in the house is the kind of experience that makes you question the very nature of memory and identity. The fact that the journal entries matched his actual experiences but were dated before his birth suggests something far more complex than simple forgotten childhood memories. It's like the room existed in some kind of temporal bubble, preserving experiences that technically never happened. Our next story takes us into the realm of technology glitches that revealed information that shouldn't have existed. I work as an IT specialist for a mid-sized marketing company, and part of my job involves managing our client database and ensuring all information is properly backed up and secure. Last month, I encountered a technical issue that still keeps me awake at night, trying to understand what happened. We were upgrading our customer management software, and I needed to migrate data from our old system to the new platform. This is routine work that I've done countless times before. The process involves exporting client information, checking for errors, and importing everything into the updated system while maintaining data integrity. During the migration, I noticed something strange in the exported files. There were client records for people and companies that I'd never heard of, with detailed information, including contact details, project histories, and billing records going back several years. At first, I assumed these were test entries that someone had created during software trials, but the data was far too detailed and consistent to be fake. The records showed completed projects, with specific dates, payment histories, and even email correspondence logs. One entry was for a company called Meridian Solutions that supposedly paid us over $40,000 for a 6-month marketing campaign in 2019. Another record belonged to a client named Robert Chen, who had apparently worked with us on multiple projects between 2020 and 2022. I checked with our accounting department to verify these transactions, but they had no record of either client. I asked the project managers if they remembered working with Meridian Solutions or Robert Chen, but nobody had ever heard of them. I even searched through our email servers and found no correspondence with either client, despite the database showing detailed communication logs. The financial records were the most puzzling aspect. The database showed specific invoice numbers, payment dates, and transaction amounts for services that had apparently been completed and paid for. But when I cross-referenced these invoices with our actual accounting software, none of them existed. The invoice numbers followed our standard format perfectly, but they weren't in our system. I decided to contact these phantom clients directly using the phone numbers and email addresses listed in the database. The phone number for Meridian Solutions was disconnected, and the emails bounced back as undeliverable. But when I searched online for Robert Chen using the address from his client record, I found something that made my blood run cold. Robert Chen had died in a car accident in early 2021, according to his obituary. The date of his death was listed as February 14th, 2021, but our database showed project completion and final payment from him on March 3rd, 2021, nearly 3 weeks after he had passed away. I brought this information to my supervisor, expecting we'd launch an investigation into potential security breaches or data corruption. Instead, she told me to delete the phantom records and continue with the migration as if nothing had happened. When I pressed for an explanation, she said, "Sometimes old systems generate corrupted data that looks realistic but doesn't represent actual business transactions, but I couldn't let it go. I made copies of the phantom records before deleting them from our official system. The level of detail was extraordinary, including project timelines, meeting notes, and even personality assessments of the clients that read like they'd been written by someone who had worked with these people extensively. The most unsettling discovery came when I found internal memos in the database discussing these phantom clients. The memos were written by employees who still work at our company, but when I asked them about the projects mentioned, they had no memory of writing the memos or working with those clients. The writing style and technical knowledge displayed in the memos matched each employee perfectly, but they insisted they'd never written anything about Meridian Solutions or Robert Chen. I've been in IT for over 15 years, and I've never seen data corruption that could generate such detailed, interconnected, and realistic information. The phantom records weren't random noise or scrambled data. They told complete stories about business relationships that apparently never existed, written by people who have no memory of creating them. That story concludes there. Database systems don't spontaneously generate detailed client histories, complete with personality assessments and internal memos. The fact that Robert Chen had died weeks before his supposed final payment suggests these records were documenting events from some alternate timeline where different business relationships existed. It's like the database somehow captured information from a parallel version of the company, where these phantom clients were real and active. Let me continue with a story that involves a family heirloom with properties that challenged everything the family thought they knew about their own history. My great-aunt passed away last year and left me her antique jewellery collection. Most of the pieces were typical vintage items from the 1940s and 1950s, but there was one necklace that immediately caught my attention. It was a delicate silver chain with an unusual pendant that seemed to change colour depending on the lighting and angle from which you viewed it. The pendant was about the size of a quarter and appeared to be made from some kind of stone or crystal that I couldn't identify. Sometimes it looked deep blue, other times it appeared green or purple, and occasionally it seemed to contain tiny points of light that moved like stars in a night sky. My great-aunt had worn it frequently, and I remembered admiring it as a child during family gatherings. When I got home with the jewellery collection, I decided to research the necklace to learn more about its origins and potential value. I took several photographs of the pendant under different lighting conditions, hoping to identify the type of stone and possibly trace its history. That's when things became strange. In every photograph I took, the pendant appeared completely different than what I could see with my naked eye. While looking directly at the necklace, I saw the colour-changing stone with its moving points of light. But in photographs, the pendant showed what appeared to be detailed landscapes, like tiny windows into other worlds. One photo revealed a mountainous region with snow-capped peaks and a small village nestled in a valley. Another showed what looked like an ocean scene with islands and sailing ships that appeared to be from a much earlier historical period. The most striking image showed a forest scene with unusual trees that had silver bark and leaves that seemed to glow with their own internal light. I showed the photographs to several family members, and they could all see the landscape images clearly. But when they looked at the actual necklace, they saw the same colour-changing stone that I did. The disconnect between direct observation and photographic evidence was consistent across everyone who examined it. My curiosity led me to contact a geology professor at the local university to see if he could identify the stone. When I showed him the photographs, he was fascinated by what appeared to be incredibly detailed microscopic engravings. But when I brought the actual necklace to his office, he saw only a simple piece of polished stone with interesting optical properties. The professor suggested using specialized equipment to examine the pendant more closely. Under a high-powered microscope, the stone revealed intricate patterns that seemed to move and shift even while we watched. The imagery was so detailed that it looked like we were viewing real locations from an impossible perspective, as if the pendant contained actual windows to distant places. The most unsettling discovery came when I found my great-aunt's diary among her personal belongings. In entries dating back over 30 years, she wrote about travelling to the places shown in the pendant's photographs. She described visiting the mountain village, sailing among the mysterious islands, and walking through the forest with the glowing trees. But according to family records, my great-aunt had rarely travelled, and had certainly never been to any locations matching the landscapes visible in the photographs. She'd lived a quiet life in the same small town for over 60 years, working as a librarian and caring for elderly relatives. Her diary entries were remarkably detailed, describing the climate, the local customs, and even conversations with people she'd met in these impossible places. She wrote about the pendant as if it were a means of transportation, referring to it as her window home, and mentioning that she could visit these locations whenever she wore the necklace during sleep. The final entry in her diary, written just weeks before she passed away, mentioned that she was leaving the necklace to me because I was the only family member who had shown genuine interest in its properties as a child. She wrote that the pendant would only reveal its true nature to someone who was ready to see beyond the ordinary world. I still wear the necklace occasionally, but I've never experienced the kind of travel my great-aunt described in her diary. The photographs continue to show the mysterious landscapes, and the pendant still changes colour when I look at it directly. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can feel a slight warmth from the stone, as if it's trying to communicate something I'm not yet ready to understand. That story ends there. An heirloom that shows different realities in photographs than what you can see directly suggests some kind of dimensional viewing device masquerading as jewellery. The fact that his great-aunt documented detailed travels to these photographed locations while apparently never leaving her small town raises incredible questions about consciousness, projection, and the nature of experience itself. It's like she discovered a way to visit parallel worlds through dreams while wearing the pendant. Our next story involves a neighbourhood that seemed to exist in multiple versions of reality simultaneously. I moved to a quiet suburban neighbourhood 2 years ago, thinking I'd found the perfect place to settle down. The houses were well maintained, the streets were tree-lined, and everyone seemed friendly enough during my initial visits. But after living there for a few months, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. The first strange thing was the house directly across from mine. Sometimes it was painted blue with white shutters, and other times it appeared to be grey with black trim. I initially thought maybe the owners were in the middle of renovating, but the changes would happen overnight with no signs of construction work or painting equipment. I mentioned this to my neighbour, Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door to me. She looked at me strangely and said the Morrison house had always been grey with black trim for as long as she could remember, but I was certain I'd seen it blue just the day before. I even checked photos I'd taken when I first moved in, and sure enough, the house appeared blue in some pictures and grey in others, sometimes within the same roll of film. The inconsistencies weren't limited to that one house. The corner store at the end of our street would sometimes be called Murphy's Market, and other times Thompson's Grocery. The signage, the interior layout, and even the products they carried would be completely different depending on when I visited. But whenever I asked other residents about these changes, they acted like I was confused or mistaken. The most unsettling discovery came when I started keeping a journal of these observations. I documented the appearance of various houses, businesses, and even street signs, taking photographs whenever possible. After several months of record keeping, I realised I was living in a neighbourhood that seemed to exist in at least 3 different versions. In version A, the Morrison house was blue, Murphy's Market sold organic produce, and there was a small park between Oak Street and Maple Avenue. In version B, the Morrison house was grey, Thompson's Grocery focused on conventional foods, and the space between Oak and Maple was occupied by additional residential properties. Version C featured elements from both other versions plus unique characteristics I'd never seen elsewhere. The transitions between versions weren't gradual. I'd go to bed in version A and wake up in version B, with no explanation for how or when the change occurred. My own house remained consistent across all versions, as did most of the residents, but their memories seemed to adjust to match whichever version was currently active. I decided to test this phenomenon by leaving a note for Mrs. Patterson about the Morrison house colour. In version A, I wrote that the house was currently blue and asked her to confirm this. When I checked back the next day, we were in version B, and my note had changed. It now read that the house was grey, written in my own handwriting, even though I distinctly remembered writing about it being blue. The psychological strain of living in a reality that shifted without warning became overwhelming. I started questioning my own memory and sanity. Was I experiencing some kind of breakdown? Or was I genuinely witnessing multiple versions of the same neighbourhood overlapping in impossible ways? I tried to find evidence that would remain consistent across all versions. I buried a small metal box in my backyard containing photographs, newspaper clippings, and detailed notes about the different neighbourhood configurations. When I dug it up weeks later, the contents had changed to match whatever version was currently active, as if reality was automatically correcting itself to maintain consistency. The final test came when I decided to move away. I put my house on the market and began looking for a new place to live. But every time I tried to leave the neighbourhood, I'd somehow end up back at my own front door with no memory of how I'd gotten there. It was like the overlapping realities had created a trap that prevented anyone from escaping once they'd become aware of the shifting nature of the area. I'm still living in the same house, still documenting the changes, but I've stopped trying to convince other people about what I'm experiencing. They exist comfortably within whichever version happens to be active, their memories automatically adjusting to maintain the illusion of consistency. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the glitch in this system, the one element that refuses to conform to the shifting reality around me. That story comes to an end right there. Living in a neighbourhood that literally rewrites itself overnight while everyone else's memories adjust to match would be absolutely maddening. The fact that his own notes changed to reflect whichever reality was active suggests he's trapped in some kind of dimensional pocket where multiple timelines are bleeding together. At least he's documenting it, even if the documentation keeps changing on him. The idea that he can't physically leave once he became aware of the glitch is terrifying. Like consciousness itself has become a prison. Moving into our next experience, here's a story about a routine medical appointment that revealed something impossible about the nature of identity. I went to my family doctor last month for a routine physical exam, something I do annually as part of maintaining good health. I'd been seeing Dr. Williams for about 5 years, and these appointments were always straightforward and predictable. But this visit turned into something I'm still trying to process. When I arrived at the medical office, everything seemed normal. I checked in with the receptionist, waited in the familiar lobby, and was called back to an examination room at my scheduled time. Dr. Williams entered the room carrying my file, greeted me warmly, and began asking his usual questions about my general health and any concerns I might have. About 10 minutes into the appointment, Dr. Williams paused while reviewing my chart and looked at me with a confused expression. He asked if I'd been experiencing any memory problems or unusual symptoms lately. When I told him I felt fine, he showed me my medical file and asked me to explain something that didn't make sense. According to my official medical records, I had died 3 months earlier from complications following a minor surgical procedure. The file contained detailed notes about my decline, hospitalization, and eventual death, all documented in Dr. Williams's own handwriting. There was even a death certificate with his signature, listing the cause of death and time of passing. I stared at the documents in disbelief. The handwriting was definitely Dr. Williams's, and the medical terminology and details were far too specific to be fabricated. But I was obviously sitting in his office, very much alive, having a conversation about records that claimed I was deceased. Dr. Williams was equally baffled. He remembered writing those notes and signing the death certificate, but he also clearly remembered seeing me for regular appointments after the date of my supposed death. He pulled up his appointment calendar and showed me entries for visits I'd made in the months following my documented demise. We called in the office manager to review the situation. She confirmed that my file contained the death certificate and final medical notes, but she also had records of me scheduling and attending appointments after that date. The computer system showed I was listed as both deceased and as an active patient simultaneously. The strangest part was when Dr. Williams asked me about the surgical procedure mentioned in the death records. I had no memory of ever having surgery, and there were no scars or other physical evidence that any procedure had been performed. But the medical notes described the operation in detail, including my pre-surgical consultation, the procedure itself, and my post-operative care. Dr. Williams examined me thoroughly, looking for any signs that the documented medical procedures had actually taken place. He found nothing to suggest I'd ever been hospitalized or undergone surgery. My physical condition was exactly what he'd expect for someone with my medical history, minus the procedures described in the death records. We spent over an hour trying to make sense of the situation. Dr. Williams called the hospital mentioned in my death records, but they had no record of me ever being a patient there. He contacted the funeral home listed on some of the paperwork, but they'd never handled arrangements for anyone with my name. The medical office's insurance records showed claims filed for my final treatment and death-related expenses, but those claims had been denied because I was still listed as a living patient in other parts of their system. It was like two different versions of my medical history were existing simultaneously within the same database. Dr. Williams eventually made copies of all the contradictory documents and suggested I keep them in case other medical providers encountered similar discrepancies. He updated my file to indicate that I was definitely alive and active, but he kept the death records as well, unable to explain how they'd gotten there, or why he remembered creating them. I've since visited other doctors and medical facilities, and my records are completely normal everywhere else. Only Dr. Williams's office contains the documentation of my supposed death, as if that particular medical practice exists in a reality where I died while the rest of the world continues in a timeline where I survived. That story ends there. Having official medical records documenting your own death while you're sitting in the doctor's office discussing them is surreal beyond belief. The fact that Dr. Williams remembered writing those death records and signing the certificate, while also remembering continued appointments, creates a paradox that defies explanation. It's like two different timelines converged in that one medical office, leaving contradictory evidence of parallel outcomes. Our next story takes us into the realm of digital communication, where a simple text message opened a window into something that shouldn't exist. I received a text message last Tuesday that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The message came from my sister's phone number, but the content made no sense. It read, "Thanks for helping me move the piano yesterday. Mum's new house looks great with it in the living room." This was confusing because my sister had never owned a piano, my mother hadn't moved recently, and I certainly hadn't helped anyone move furniture the day before. I called my sister immediately to ask about the message, but she insisted she hadn't sent it and had no idea what I was talking about. When I showed her the text on my phone, she could see it clearly, but she had no record of sending it in her message history. According to her phone, the last text she'd sent me was from several days earlier about meeting for lunch. She suggested maybe someone had spoofed her number or there'd been some kind of technical glitch. But then she mentioned something that made the situation even stranger. She said she'd actually been thinking about getting a piano lately and had been browsing online listings for used instruments. She'd also been helping our mother look at smaller houses because Mum had mentioned wanting to downsize from her current home. I decided to call my mother to ask about her moving plans. She seemed surprised by my question and said she'd been considering selling the house, but hadn't made any concrete decisions. When I mentioned the piano, she got excited and said she'd always wanted one, but never had the space in her current home. Over the next few days, I received more text messages from my sister's number describing events that hadn't happened, but seemed related to things that might happen in the future. One message thanked me for helping with Mum's yard sale. Another mentioned how nice the new kitchen looked after the renovation. Each message described activities involving family members helping each other with tasks related to my mother's potential move and downsizing. But none of these events had actually occurred, and my sister continued to deny sending any of the messages. The situation became more complex when I started receiving texts from other family members' numbers describing the same fictional events from their perspectives. My cousin sent a message about how much she enjoyed the housewarming party at Mum's new place. My uncle texted about borrowing my truck to help move furniture. None of these family members had any memory of sending these messages, and none of the described events had taken place. But the messages were remarkably detailed and consistent, painting a picture of a coordinated family effort to help my mother transition to a smaller home. Then, about 2 weeks after the first mysterious text, my mother called to say she'd found a perfect little house and wanted to put an offer on it. She asked if I could help her start sorting through her belongings and possibly assist with moving when the time came. My sister called the same day to say she'd found a beautiful antique piano at an estate sale and thought it would be perfect for Mum's new place. She wanted to know if I could help her transport it once Mum was settled in her smaller home. As these real events began to unfold, I realised they were following the exact sequence described in the mysterious text messages I'd been receiving. Every detail mentioned in the phantom texts was coming true, from the specific house my mother chose to the type of piano my sister wanted to buy. I kept all the messages as documentation, and as each event occurred in real life, I could reference the texts that had described them weeks in advance. It was like I'd been receiving updates about future family activities from some alternate version of reality where these events had already taken place. The messages stopped coming once all the described events had actually happened. My mother is now settled in her new home, with the piano in her living room, exactly as the first mysterious text had described. But I still have no explanation for how I received detailed accounts of these events before they occurred. That story ends right there. Getting text messages from your family describing events that haven't happened yet, but then watching them unfold exactly as described is like having a direct line to the future. The fact that multiple family members' numbers were sending these prophetic messages while none of them remember doing it suggests some kind of temporal communication glitch. It's as if their future selves found a way to update the past about upcoming family activities. Here's the next story, involving a childhood friend who may have existed in more ways than one. When I was 9 years old, I had a best friend named Timothy who lived 3 houses down from me on Elm Street. We spent every day together during the summer of 1994, riding bikes, building forts, and exploring the woods behind our neighbourhood. Timothy was funny, adventurous, and shared my love of comic books and baseball cards. At the end of that summer, Timothy's family moved away to another state. We promised to write letters and stay in touch, but, like most childhood friendships interrupted by distance, we gradually lost contact. I have clear memories of our adventures together, and I even kept some of the comic books we'd traded back and forth. 25 years later, I decided to look up Timothy on social media to see how his life had turned out. I searched for his full name, tried various combinations, and even looked through old school records to find more information about his family. But I couldn't find any trace of him anywhere online. This seemed strange in an era where almost everyone has some kind of digital footprint. So I decided to contact other childhood friends to see if they remembered Timothy. I reached out to classmates, neighbours and kids who had lived in our area during that summer. None of them remembered Timothy at all. They all recalled me playing alone a lot that summer, spending time by myself in the woods, and often talking to imaginary friends. According to everyone I contacted, I had never had a friend named Timothy living on our street. I was convinced they were mistaken, so I decided to visit my childhood neighbourhood to refresh my memory and possibly find evidence of Timothy's existence. When I got to Elm Street, I walked to the house where Timothy's family had lived. The current residents had been there for over 15 years and had no knowledge of any family with that name ever living in the house. I checked with the local school district to see if Timothy had been enrolled during the 1993-94 school year. There were no records of any student with his name, and the class photos from that period showed no one matching his appearance. It was like Timothy had been completely erased from all official documentation. But I still had physical evidence of our friendship. I found the comic books we'd traded, and some of them had his name written inside the covers in a child's handwriting that was different from my own. I also found photographs from that summer that showed me playing with another child who matched Timothy's appearance exactly. When I showed these photos to my parents, they seemed confused and concerned. They insisted the other child in the pictures was me, photographed from different angles or at different times. But I could clearly see two distinct children in the same frame, and one of them was definitely Timothy. I took the photos to a professional photo analyst to determine if they had been manipulated or were the result of double exposure. The analysis confirmed that the images were authentic and unaltered, showing two separate children playing together in various outdoor locations. The most compelling evidence was a letter I found among my old belongings. It was addressed to me from Timothy, postmarked from his new city, and described his new school and how much he missed our adventures together. The handwriting was clearly from a child, and the details about his move matched what I remembered about his family's relocation. But when I tried to trace the return address on the letter, I discovered that the street mentioned didn't exist in the city where it was supposedly mailed from. The postal code was also invalid, and the post office had no record of ever processing mail from that location. I'm now convinced that Timothy existed, but perhaps not in the same reality as everyone else around me. The physical evidence of our friendship is real and tangible, but he seems to have left no trace in anyone else's memory or in any official records. It's like he existed in a parallel version of my childhood that only I experienced. That story concludes there. Having concrete physical evidence of a friendship that everyone else insists never happened is profoundly isolating and confusing. The fact that photos show two distinct children while everyone else sees only one person suggests he was interacting with someone who existed in a slightly different dimensional space. Sometimes, the most meaningful relationships in our lives happen with people who don't quite belong to our version of reality. These next few stories are going to challenge everything you think you know about the nature of memory and consciousness itself. I work as a night janitor at a large university library, and I've been doing this job for about 8 years now. The work is quiet and routine, which I prefer since I'm naturally more of a night person anyway. I know every floor, every reading room, and every hidden corner of that massive building like the back of my hand. About 3 months ago, I started noticing a student who would come in every night around 11 p.m. and stay until I had to lock up at 2 a.m. She always sat at the same table on the 4th floor, always had the same stack of thick textbooks, and always wore a blue sweater with her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was incredibly focused and never seemed to notice me cleaning around her. I didn't think much of it at first. Graduate students often keep strange hours, and the library stays open late specifically to accommodate serious scholars. But after seeing her there every single night for weeks, I started to feel a little concerned about her well-being. She never seemed to eat anything or take breaks, just sat there reading and taking notes with intense concentration. One night in early October, I decided to approach her table to empty the trash can nearby and maybe strike up a friendly conversation. As I got closer, I could see she was reading what appeared to be advanced mathematics textbooks, with pages covered in complex equations and formulas I couldn't begin to understand. When I said hello and asked how her studies were going, she looked up at me with a confused expression. She seemed genuinely surprised to see me standing there, like she hadn't noticed me approaching, despite the sound of my cleaning cart rolling across the floor. She smiled politely and said her research was going well, then immediately returned to her books. Over the following weeks, I tried to engage her in small talk whenever I cleaned near her table. She was always pleasant but seemed distracted, like she was only partially present in our conversations. She mentioned she was working on her doctoral dissertation in theoretical physics, and that she often lost track of time when she was deep in thought about her research. The strange thing was that she never seemed to age or change at all. After months of seeing her every night, she looked exactly the same as when I first noticed her. Same blue sweater, same hairstyle, same youthful appearance. Even her stack of books never changed, all with the same thick volumes arranged in the same order. I started paying closer attention to the details of our interactions. She always sat in the exact same position, always had her pen in her right hand, and always had the same textbook open to what appeared to be the same page. Her note-taking seemed repetitive too, like she was copying the same equations over and over again. One night in November, I decided to test something. After she left at closing time, I placed a small piece of tape on the corner of her usual table, just to see if she would notice it the next evening. When she arrived the following night, she sat down at the table as usual, but the tape was gone. I hadn't removed it, and no other cleaning staff worked that section. I started leaving different small markers around her study area, a paperclip on the floor, a pencil placed at an unusual angle, a book moved slightly out of position. Every morning, these items would be gone or returned to their original locations, even though I was the only person with access to the library after closing. The breakthrough came when I decided to check the university's enrollment records. I asked a friend who works in the registrar's office to look up information about graduate students in the physics department. She searched through current enrollment, recent graduates, and even students from previous years, but there was no record of anyone matching the description of my nightly library visitor. My friend also checked the keycard access logs for the library. According to the electronic records, no one had entered or exited the building during the hours when I regularly saw the student. The logs showed only my own card being used to enter at the start of my shift and to exit when I locked up at closing time. I brought this information to my supervisor, thinking maybe there was some kind of security issue or unauthorized access to the building. But when I described the student I'd been seeing every night, my supervisor looked at me with concern and said I was the only person in the library during those late hours. The security cameras confirmed this. When we reviewed footage from the 4th floor during the times I'd been interacting with the student, the videos showed me talking to an empty table, gesturing and nodding as if I was having conversations with someone who wasn't there. I watched months of security footage, and in every single recording, I was alone on that floor. But I could clearly remember our conversations, her polite responses to my questions, even the sound of her turning pages as she read. The disconnect between my memories and the video evidence was deeply disturbing. The final piece of the puzzle came when I researched the history of the library building. In 1987, a graduate student named Catherine Morris had been working late on her doctoral dissertation in theoretical physics when she suffered a fatal heart attack at a study table on the 4th floor. She was found the next morning by the cleaning staff, still sitting in her chair with her research spread out in front of her. The photograph in the newspaper article about her death showed a young woman with dark hair, pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a blue sweater, surrounded by thick mathematics textbooks. She looked exactly like the student I'd been talking to every night for months. Catherine had been 26 years old when she died, just weeks away from completing her doctorate. According to the article, she was known for her intense dedication to her research and often stayed in the library until closing time, working alone on complex equations that few people could understand. I still work the night shift at the library, but I haven't seen Catherine since I learned about her death. The 4th floor feels different now, quieter somehow, like something that had been restless finally found peace. Sometimes I wonder if she was trying to finish her dissertation, trapped in an endless loop of research until someone finally acknowledged her presence and helped her story be remembered. That story is over. The idea of having months of detailed conversations with someone who died decades ago is both heartbreaking and terrifying. Catherine seemed so real, so present, that even security footage couldn't shake his memories of their interactions. Maybe some spirits are so dedicated to their work that they continue their research long after their physical bodies have given up. The fact that she disappeared once he learned her story suggests she just needed someone to remember her dedication and help her find closure. Let's move into our next story, which involves a family tradition that revealed something impossible about the nature of time itself. My family has always been really close, and we have this tradition where we take a group photo every Christmas morning before opening presents. We've been doing this since I was a little kid, and my parents have albums full of these holiday pictures going back over 30 years. Last Christmas, something happened that I'm still trying to understand. We were setting up for our usual family photo when my mum noticed that my dad was wearing the same red sweater he'd worn in previous years. She joked that he needed to expand his holiday wardrobe, and we all laughed as we positioned ourselves around the Christmas tree. My younger brother was visiting from college. My sister had brought her new boyfriend, and my grandparents had driven in from their retirement community. It was a perfect family gathering, and everyone was in great spirits as we prepared to take the photo. But when my mum looked through the camera viewfinder to frame the shot, she made this strange noise and lowered the camera with a confused expression. She said she could see someone in the background who wasn't supposed to be there, someone standing behind the couch who didn't belong in our living room. We all turned to look, but there was nobody behind the couch. The space was empty, except for some wrapped presents and our usual holiday decorations. My mum insisted she could see a figure through the camera lens, but when she looked with her naked eye, nothing was there. My dad suggested maybe there was something wrong with the camera, so he took it from my mum and looked through the viewfinder himself. He immediately went pale and handed the camera to me without saying anything. When I looked through the lens, I could see what they were talking about. Standing behind the couch, partially obscured by the Christmas tree, was my Uncle Robert. He was wearing the same brown jacket he'd always worn to family gatherings, and he was smiling at the camera just like he did in all our old holiday photos. The problem was that Uncle Robert had died in a car accident 8 years earlier. I passed the camera around to other family members, and everyone could see Uncle Robert clearly through the viewfinder. But when we looked directly at the area where he appeared to be standing, there was nothing there. It was like he existed only in whatever dimension the camera could access. My grandmother started crying when she saw him through the lens. She said he looked exactly like he did during our last Christmas together before the accident, down to the way he always stood with his hands in his pockets and that gentle smile he got during family photos. We decided to take the picture anyway, thinking maybe Uncle Robert was trying to be part of our family gathering one more time. As we posed for the shot, I kept the camera positioned so it would capture the area where he appeared to be standing. When we developed the film a few days later, Uncle Robert was clearly visible in the background of our Christmas photo. He looked solid and real, not transparent or ghostly like you might expect in a supernatural photograph. He appeared to be a normal part of the family gathering, standing in his usual spot behind the couch. But here's where it gets even stranger. When we compared this new photo to our previous Christmas pictures, Uncle Robert appeared in those older images too, even in photos taken after his death. We pulled out albums going back several years, and he was present in every single family Christmas photo, including ones we'd looked at hundreds of times before, without ever noticing him. It was like his presence in the most recent photo had somehow retroactively inserted him into all our previous holiday pictures. My grandmother swore that Uncle Robert hadn't been in any of the older photos when we first took them, but now he was clearly visible in every single one. We brought the photos to a professional developer to see if there was some kind of technical explanation for what we were seeing. The lab confirmed that the images hadn't been manipulated or altered in any way. According to their analysis, Uncle Robert had been photographed as a normal subject in every single picture. The most unsettling discovery came when we found Uncle Robert's own camera among his belongings that we'd stored in the attic. When we developed the roll of film that was still inside, it contained photos from Christmas gatherings that had taken place after his death. The pictures showed him participating in family celebrations that he couldn't have attended, taken from his perspective as if he'd been there with his camera. One photo showed our family opening presents around the tree, taken from the exact angle where we'd seen Uncle Robert standing in our own pictures. Another showed my sister's wedding reception from 2 years ago, even though Uncle Robert had died long before she got engaged. My grandmother believes Uncle Robert found a way to attend every family gathering after his death, that his love for our holiday traditions was strong enough to transcend whatever boundaries separate life from death. She says we just never had the right perspective to see him until that Christmas morning, when the camera revealed what had always been there. I don't know what to believe, but I do know that our family photos now feel different somehow. When I look at them, I can see Uncle Robert clearly in every single image, and I can't understand how we ever missed his presence before. It's like he was always there, waiting for us to develop the ability to see him. That story is finished. The idea that a deceased family member could retroactively appear in all your previous photos is both comforting and deeply unsettling. It suggests that love and family bonds might be strong enough to transcend death itself, allowing someone to continue participating in gatherings even after they've passed away. The fact that Uncle Robert had his own photos from events he couldn't have attended physically makes you wonder if consciousness can exist independently of the body and continue documenting life from beyond. Our next story takes us into the realm of childhood experiences that defied every rule of physics and logic. When I was 12 years old, I discovered I could do something that shouldn't have been possible. It started during a particularly boring summer when my parents were both working long hours and I was spending most of my time alone at home, trying to entertain myself with books and television. I was lying on my bedroom floor one afternoon, staring at the ceiling and feeling incredibly restless, when I noticed that my reflection in the mirror across the room was doing something different than what I was doing. I was lying flat on my back, but my reflection appeared to be sitting up and looking directly at me. At first, I thought it was just the angle of the mirror or some kind of optical illusion, but when I sat up to get a better look, my reflection remained in the lying down position. We were completely out of sync, like two different people who just happened to look identical. I experimented with this phenomenon for hours, moving my arms and legs in various ways while watching my reflection do completely different things. Sometimes my reflection would wave at me when I was standing still. Other times it would appear to be writing or drawing while I was just watching it work. The most extraordinary discovery came when I realized I could communicate with my reflection. If I mouthed words silently, my reflection would mouth different words back, and we could have entire conversations without making any sound. My reflection seemed to have its own personality and opinions, often disagreeing with things I said or suggesting activities I hadn't thought of. My reflection told me its name was Marcus, and it lived in a world that was similar to mine, but with some important differences. In Marcus's world, our parents had different jobs, our house was painted a different colour, and some of our neighbours were completely different people. It was like looking into a parallel version of my own life. Marcus and I became friends over the course of that summer. I would spend hours in front of the mirror, talking with him about our different experiences and comparing notes about how our two worlds differed. He was dealing with many of the same challenges I was, but he often had creative solutions I wouldn't have thought of on my own. The relationship became so important to me that I started arranging my daily schedule around our mirror conversations. I would rush home from any activities just to spend time talking with Marcus, and I found myself looking forward to our discussions more than anything else in my life. One day in late July, Marcus told me he'd figured out a way for us to switch places temporarily. He said he'd been experimenting with reaching through the mirror surface, and he thought we could actually trade positions for short periods of time. I was both excited and terrified by this possibility. The first time we attempted the switch, I placed my hand against the mirror surface and felt it give way like it was made of thick liquid instead of solid glass. Marcus's hand came through from the other side, and when we touched, I felt this incredible, rushing sensation, like I was falling through space. Suddenly I was standing in Marcus's world, looking back through the mirror at my own bedroom, from the opposite's perspective. Everything was familiar, but slightly different, like a photograph that had been reversed. The experience only lasted for a few minutes before we switched back, but it was the most amazing thing that had ever happened to me. We continued these exchanges throughout the rest of the summer, sometimes spending entire afternoons in each other's worlds. I got to meet Marcus's version of our parents, explore his slightly different neighborhood, and experience life from a completely different perspective. The switches became longer and more frequent as we got better at the process. Sometimes I would spend entire days in Marcus's world while he experienced life in mine. Our parents never seemed to notice the difference, which made me wonder if the changes were too subtle for anyone else to detect. But as school started approaching in late August, Marcus began acting strange during our conversations. He seemed distant and worried about something he wouldn't explain. When I asked him what was wrong, he said he'd been talking to other reflection people and had learned something disturbing about our exchanges. According to what Marcus had discovered, the switching process was gradually merging our two worlds together. Each time we traded places, small details from his reality would remain in mine, and vice versa. Eventually, the two worlds would become so mixed up that neither of us would be able to find our way back to our original lives. Marcus said we needed to stop switching immediately and try to return to our proper worlds permanently. He seemed genuinely frightened about what might happen if we continued our exchanges, but I didn't want to lose our friendship or the amazing experiences we'd been sharing. We had one final conversation through the mirror where Marcus explained that he would have to stop appearing in my reflection to prevent any further mixing of our realities. He said our friendship had been the best part of his summer too, but that we were risking both of our worlds by continuing to interact. The last time I saw Marcus, he waved goodbye and then simply faded away from the mirror. After that, my reflection returned to normal, perfectly matching my own movements and expressions like reflections are supposed to do. I tried for weeks to re-establish contact, but Marcus never appeared again. I'm 28 now, and I still think about that summer sometimes. I've never been able to replicate what happened with Marcus, and I've never found anyone who believes my story about having a friendship with my own reflection. But I know it was real, and I know Marcus was a genuine person from a parallel world who became my closest friend during a time when I really needed one. Sometimes when I look in mirrors, I wonder if Marcus is still there in his world, living his life parallel to mine, but just beyond the reach of normal reflection. I hope he's happy, and that our brief friendship meant as much to him as it did to me. That story comes to an end. Having a genuine friendship with your reflection, who turns out to be a person from a parallel world, is the kind of childhood experience that would shape your entire understanding of reality. The fact that they could physically switch places and experience each other's worlds suggests that mirrors might be more than just reflective surfaces. Maybe they're actually windows between dimensions that most people never learn to access. The bittersweet ending, where Marcus had to disappear to protect both their realities, adds a layer of sacrifice that makes their friendship even more meaningful. Let's dive into our next experience, which involves a workplace situation that challenged everything the protagonist thought they knew about memory and identity. I work as a receptionist at a busy medical office, and part of my job involves maintaining patient files and scheduling appointments. It's routine work that I've been doing for about 4 years, and I pride myself on being organised and detail-oriented. But last month something happened that made me question my own competence and sanity. A woman named Patricia Collins came in for her appointment on a Tuesday morning. She was probably in her 60s, well-dressed, and very polite as she checked in for her 10 a.m. slot with Dr. Harrison. I found her file in our system, confirmed her insurance information, and had her take a seat in the waiting room. About 20 minutes later, Dr. Harrison came out to the front desk looking confused. He asked me about Patricia Collins and why she was on his schedule, because he'd never heard of her before and had no record of her ever being his patient. I showed him the appointment entry in our computer system and pulled up her patient file, which contained detailed medical history going back over 3 years. Dr. Harrison reviewed Patricia's file and found comprehensive records of regular visits, prescription renewals, and even notes from procedures he'd supposedly performed. The handwriting in the physical charts was definitely his, and the computer entries were made using his login credentials. But he had absolutely no memory of ever treating this patient. We called Patricia back to the front desk to try to resolve the confusion. She seemed genuinely surprised by Dr. Harrison's claim that he didn't remember her. She described their previous appointments in detail, mentioned specific conversations they'd had about her medical conditions, and even referenced jokes he'd supposedly made during examinations. Dr. Harrison was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but agreed to see Patricia anyway, thinking maybe he was having memory issues or that she was confusing him with another doctor. The appointment lasted about 30 minutes, and when they finished, Dr. Harrison asked me to speak with him privately. He told me that Patricia had detailed knowledge about medical procedures and treatments that perfectly matched the notes in her file. She knew exactly which medications she'd been prescribed and could describe the progression of her treatment over several years. But Dr. Harrison was absolutely certain he'd never seen her before that morning. The situation became even stranger when I checked our billing records. Patricia's insurance had been charged for dozens of appointments and procedures over the past 3 years, and all the claims had been processed and paid without any issues. The financial trail clearly showed an established doctor-patient relationship. I decided to call Patricia's insurance company to verify her coverage and see if they had any additional information about her medical history. The representative confirmed that Patricia had been receiving regular treatment from Dr. Harrison's practice, and that all her claims had been legitimate and properly documented. When I asked other staff members if they remembered Patricia as a regular patient, the responses were mixed and confusing. Some nurses insisted they'd worked with her many times and could describe her personality and medical needs in detail. Others had no memory of her at all and seemed surprised when I showed them her extensive patient file. The most unsettling discovery came when I found Patricia's appointment cards in our filing system. These were physical cards that patients receive after each visit, with handwritten appointment dates and times. Patricia had dozens of these cards going back years, all filled out in Dr. Harrison's handwriting, confirming future appointments that had apparently taken place as scheduled. I brought this evidence to Dr. Harrison, who examined the appointment cards carefully. He confirmed that the handwriting was definitely his, and he recognized his typical abbreviations and scheduling patterns. But he had no memory of writing any of those cards or scheduling any of those appointments. Dr. Harrison decided to consult with his colleague, Dr. Martinez, who practices in the same building. When we explained the situation, Dr. Martinez said he remembered Patricia as one of Dr. Harrison's regular patients and had even consulted on some of her cases. He could describe her medical conditions and treatment history in detail. But when Dr. Martinez tried to access his own notes about Patricia's consultations, he couldn't find any records of their interactions. His computer showed no entries related to her care, and his physical files contained no documentation of the collaborative work he clearly remembered doing. We spent hours trying to piece together the evidence, but every lead created more questions. Patricia existed in our patient database, our billing system, our insurance records, and in the memories of some staff members. But she was completely absent from the recollections of the doctors who had supposedly been treating her for years. Patricia returned for a follow-up appointment the next week, and Dr. Harrison decided to treat her as he would any established patient, relying on the detailed notes in her file to guide the consultation. The appointment went smoothly, and Patricia seemed pleased with the continuity of care. After she left, Dr. Harrison updated her file with notes from the recent visit. His handwriting and clinical observations were consistent with the previous entries, as if he'd been treating Patricia all along, but he still had no personal memory of their relationship or any of their previous interactions. I've continued scheduling Patricia's regular appointments, and Dr. Harrison has been treating her based on the extensive records in our system. She's a pleasant patient who seems genuinely fond of Dr. Harrison and appreciative of the care she's been receiving for years. But the mystery remains unsolved. How can someone exist so thoroughly in our medical records and billing system while being completely absent from the memories of the people who supposedly created those records? It's like Patricia exists in the documentation of our practice, but not in the lived experience of the staff who should remember her. That story ends there. Having comprehensive medical records and billing history for a patient that nobody remembers treating is like discovering evidence of a parallel timeline running alongside your normal work life. Patricia clearly exists and has been receiving care, but somehow the memories of providing that care were never formed or have been selectively erased. It makes you wonder how many other patients might exist in the documentation without existing in the actual memories of their healthcare providers. Moving into our next story, here's an experience that involves a family heirloom with properties that seem to transcend the normal rules of photography and time. My great-grandmother left me her vintage camera when she passed away last year. It was a beautiful old film camera from the 1940s that she'd used to document family gatherings and special occasions throughout her life. The camera came with several rolls of undeveloped film and detailed instructions she'd written about proper exposure and development techniques. I've always been interested in photography, so I was excited to experiment with this vintage equipment and maybe capture some artistic images with authentic film grain and colouring. I loaded one of the old rolls of film and spent a weekend taking pictures around my neighbourhood, focusing on architectural details and natural lighting. When I took the film to be developed, I expected to see the typical results of amateur photography with vintage equipment. But when I picked up the prints, I was shocked by what I found. Mixed in with my neighbourhood photos were pictures I had never taken, showing people and places I didn't recognise. One image showed a family gathered around a dining table for what appeared to be a holiday meal. The clothing and hairstyle suggested the photo was from several decades ago, but the image quality was identical to my recent photographs. Another picture showed children playing in a backyard that wasn't anywhere I'd been. I assumed there had been some kind of mix-up at the photo lab, but when I checked the negative strips, these mysterious images were definitely on the same roll of film I'd shot. They were interspersed with my own photographs in the exact sequence I remembered taking them. The photo lab technician confirmed that all the images had come from a single roll of film and that there was no evidence of double exposure or technical errors. According to the timestamps on the negatives, the mysterious family photos had been taken at the same time as my neighbourhood pictures. I decided to experiment further by loading another roll of the vintage film and taking more pictures. This time, I carefully documented each shot I took, writing down the subject, location, and approximate time for every exposure. I wanted to see if the same phenomenon would occur again. When this second roll was developed, it contained even more mysterious images mixed in with my documented photographs. There were pictures of what appeared to be family reunions, birthday parties, and casual gatherings, all featuring people I'd never seen before, but who seemed oddly familiar. The strangest discovery was that some of these mystery photos showed the same people at different ages, as if I was somehow capturing images from multiple time periods within their lives. One roll might contain a picture of a young couple at their wedding, followed by images of the same people as elderly grandparents surrounded by children. I brought the photographs to my great-grandmother's sister, thinking maybe she could identify the people in the mystery images. When she saw the pictures, she became very emotional and said they showed family members and events from decades past, including relatives who had died long before I was born. My great-aunt pointed out specific people in the photographs and told me their names and stories. There was my great-great-grandfather as a young man, my great-grandmother's siblings during their childhood, and even family friends who had been important parts of their lives in the 1920s and 1930s. What made this even more impossible was that, according to my great-aunt, many of these photographs showed events that had never been documented before. She recognized the people and could place the time periods based on their ages and clothing, but she insisted no one had been taking pictures at those particular gatherings. My great-aunt explained that cameras were expensive and film was precious during those earlier decades, so family photos were usually reserved for major occasions like weddings or graduations. The casual, everyday moments I was somehow capturing had never been photographed because people couldn't afford to waste film on routine family activities. I continued using the vintage camera, and each roll produced the same mixture of my contemporary photos and these historical family images. The mystery pictures seemed to follow a chronological pattern, showing the progression of my family's history across multiple generations. The most remarkable discovery came when I found a photo that showed my great-grandmother as a young woman, holding the exact same camera I was now using. She was standing in what appeared to be the same location where I'd taken one of my own photographs, as if we were separated by decades but somehow sharing the same moment. I showed this image to my great-aunt, and she confirmed it was definitely my great-grandmother from around 1943. But she was puzzled because my great-grandmother had never owned a camera during that time period. The family couldn't afford such luxuries during the war years, and my great-grandmother hadn't acquired her first camera until the late 1950s. I decided to research the camera's history by tracking down the serial number and manufacturer information. What I discovered was disturbing and impossible. According to the company's records, this particular camera had never been manufactured. The serial number didn't exist in their database, and the model features were combinations of technologies that had never been used together. The camera appeared to be an authentic 1940s model, but it incorporated design elements from different manufacturers and time periods that should have been incompatible. It was like someone had created a camera using knowledge and components that spanned several decades of photographic technology. My great-aunt revealed something she'd never told anyone before. She said my great-grandmother had always claimed she could see family members who had passed away, and that she often talked about receiving visits from relatives who had died years earlier. The family had assumed these were just stories or signs of aging, but my great-aunt now wondered if they'd been something more. She also mentioned that my great-grandmother had been obsessed with preserving family history and had always regretted that so many important moments had gone undocumented. She used to say she wished she could go back and photograph all the family gatherings and everyday moments that had been lost to time. I realized that somehow, through this impossible camera, my great-grandmother had found a way to document the family history she'd always wanted to preserve. The photographs I was developing weren't just random images from the past, they were a carefully curated collection of memories that someone had chosen to capture and pass down. The camera seemed to be fulfilling my great-grandmother's wish to create a complete photographic record of our family's history. Each roll of film I used added more pieces to this impossible archive, showing me relatives and moments that had existed long before my birth, but had somehow been waiting for the right person to discover them. I filled several albums with these mystery photographs, and they've become treasured family documents that help us understand our history in ways we never could before. The images provide glimpses into the daily lives, personalities, and relationships of family members who had been lost to time. I still use the camera regularly, and it continues to produce this mixture of contemporary and historical images. Sometimes I feel like I'm collaborating with my great-grandmother across the decades, helping her complete the family documentation project she'd always dreamed of creating. That story concludes there. Using a camera that somehow captures historical family photos alongside your own contemporary shots is like having a direct connection to your ancestors' memories. The fact that your great-grandmother appears in one of the historical photos holding the same impossible camera suggests she may have found a way to transcend time itself to preserve family history. It's beautiful that she was able to fulfill her wish to document all those lost moments, even if it required bending the laws of physics to do it. Our next story comes from someone who experienced something that still haunts them years later. I work the night shift at a 24-hour gas station in a small town outside Denver. It's usually pretty quiet. Just the occasional trucker stopping for coffee and energy drinks. Maybe some college kids buying snacks after a night out. I've been working this job for about 3 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything until last Tuesday night changed my perspective on reality completely. It was around 2:30 in the morning when this woman walked in. She looked to be in her mid-30s, wearing a blue winter coat and jeans. Nothing unusual about her appearance, just a normal customer. She walked straight to the coffee station and started filling up a large cup. I went back to restocking the cigarette display behind the counter. About 5 minutes later, I heard the bell above the door chime, and I looked up to see the same woman walking in again. Same blue coat, same jeans, same everything. She walked to the exact same coffee station and started filling up the exact same size cup. I figured maybe I'd been more tired than I thought, and just imagined seeing her before. I watched her more carefully this time. She had shoulder-length brown hair, a small scar on her left cheek, and she was humming some song I didn't recognize, while she added cream and sugar to her coffee. She paid with exact change, $2.47, and said, "Have a good night," in this slightly raspy voice, before walking out. 10 minutes later, the bell chimed again. The same woman walked in wearing the same blue coat. She went to the coffee station, filled the same size cup, hummed the same song, added cream and sugar in the exact same way, paid with the exact same change, $2.47, and said, "Have a good night," in that same raspy voice. I was starting to freak out a little, but I convinced myself there had to be some logical explanation. Maybe she had forgotten something in her car and had to come back. Maybe she was buying coffee for someone else. There had to be a reason. But then it happened again, and again. For the next 2 hours, this woman came into my store exactly every 10 minutes, performed the exact same routine, said the exact same words, and left. Same coat, same scar, same humming, same $2.47 in exact change. By the 5th time I was watching the clock, and sure enough, at exactly 10-minute intervals, she would walk through that door. The 6th time she came in, I decided to test something. When she approached the counter to pay, I asked her, "Excuse me, but haven't you been in here before tonight?" She looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "No, this is my first time here. I just got off a long shift at the hospital." She paid her $2.47 and left. The 7th time, I tried a different approach. I asked her what hospital she worked at. She said, "Denver General, I'm a nurse in the ICU." Same confused expression when I asked if she'd been in before. By the 8th time, I was recording everything on my phone. I have video evidence of this woman making the same purchase, giving the same responses, acting like each visit was her first time in the store. The timestamp on my security footage shows her entering at exactly 10-minute intervals for 2 straight hours. The 9th time she walked in, I was ready with more questions. I asked her name, and she said, "Linda Morrison." I asked what she did at the hospital, and she gave me the exact same answer about being an ICU nurse. When I showed her the video on my phone of her previous visits, she stared at it with this blank expression and said, "That's impossible. I've never been here before." The 10th and final time she came in, something was different. She walked to the coffee station like always, but this time she stopped halfway there and turned to look at me. She had this strange expression on her face, like she was trying to remember something important. She stood there for about 30 seconds, just staring at me. And then she said, "I think I'm stuck." I asked her what she meant, and she said, "I keep trying to go home, but I always end up here. I don't understand what's happening to me." Then she looked around the store like she was seeing it for the first time and said, "How many times have I been here?" I told her she'd been coming in every 10 minutes for the past 2 hours, buying the same coffee, having the same conversation. She went completely pale and sat down on the floor right there in the middle of the store. She said, "I remember now. I remember all of it, every single time, but I couldn't control it. It was like watching myself from outside my body." I asked if she needed me to call someone, maybe the hospital she worked at, but she shook her head. She said, "I don't think I work at any hospital. I don't think any of this is real." Then she stood up, walked to the door, and before leaving, she turned back and said, "Thank you for helping me remember. That was 6 months ago. I've never seen her again. I've asked around town, checked with Denver General and every other hospital in the area, but no one has ever heard of Linda Morrison. The security footage from that night shows her clear as day, but when I try to show people the video, they say they can't see anyone in the footage except me talking to empty air. I still work that same shift, and I still think about that night constantly. Sometimes, I wonder if I was the one who was stuck in some kind of loop, imagining the same customer over and over, but I have the video evidence, even if no one else can see what I see. I know it happened. I know Linda Morrison was real, even if she apparently never existed. That story's absolutely chilling because there's something so unsettling about being trapped in a loop without realizing it until the very end. The fact that security footage shows her clear as day, but other people can't see her in the video makes it even more disturbing. It's like she existed in some kind of pocket dimension that only the night shift worker could access. The detail about her saying, "I think I'm stuck," gives me goosebumps because it suggests she became aware of her situation, which somehow makes it both more real and more terrifying. Moving on to our next story, this one comes from someone who experienced a glitch that completely altered their understanding of time itself. I'm a delivery driver for a local pizza place, and I've been doing this job for about 4 years. I know every street in this city like the back of my hand, every shortcut, every traffic pattern. What happened to me 3 weeks ago has me questioning whether I know anything at all. It was a Friday night around 9:30 p.m. when I got an order for 1247 Maple Street. I'd delivered to that address dozens of times before. It's a small blue house with a white picket fence, usually ordered by an elderly man named Robert, who always tips exactly $3 and asks about my family. Simple delivery, nothing unusual. I loaded the pizza into my delivery bag and headed out. The drive to Maple Street normally takes about 12 minutes from our location. I know because I've timed it before during slow nights. I took my usual route. Main Street to Oak Avenue, then a right on Elm, and finally a left onto Maple, standard route that I could drive with my eyes closed. But when I turned onto Maple Street, something was wrong. Instead of the familiar row of small houses I'd seen hundreds of times, there was nothing but empty lots overgrown with weeds and a few old foundation stones scattered around. No houses, no street numbers, no white picket fence, just vacant land that looked like it had been empty for decades. I thought maybe I'd taken a wrong turn somehow, even though that seemed impossible, given how well I knew the area. I pulled over and checked the GPS on my phone. It clearly showed I was on Maple Street, exactly where I was supposed to be. The GPS even showed the outline of houses on the map, but when I looked around, there was nothing there. I called the customer to let him know I was having trouble finding the address. The phone rang several times before an automated message said the number was no longer in service. I tried calling again, thinking maybe I'd dialed wrong, but got the same message. I drove back to the pizza place to report the problem. When I walked in, my manager looked confused and asked where I'd been. I told him I couldn't find the address on Maple Street because there were no houses there. He pulled up the order on the computer and showed me the screen. According to the system, the order had been placed 6 hours earlier at 3:30 p.m, not 9:30 p.m. like I remembered. The timestamp on the order The credit card processing, everything showed 3:30. But I clearly remembered taking the order at 9:30 because I'd just finished my dinner break. My manager said I'd left for the delivery at 3:45 p.m. and that everyone had been looking for me because I'd been gone for almost 6 hours. He showed me the security footage of me leaving with the pizza at 3:45, but I had no memory of that. In my mind, I'd just left 20 minutes ago. The really weird part was that the pizza in my delivery bag was still hot. Not warm, not room temperature, but hot like it had just come out of the oven. After supposedly being in my car for 6 hours, it should have been ice cold. I drove back to Maple Street the next day during daylight hours. The street was exactly as I remembered it. Small houses, white picket fences, normal neighbourhood. 1247 Maple Street was the blue house I'd delivered to so many times before. I knocked on the door and Robert answered. I asked him if he'd ordered pizza the day before, and he said yes, but that no one ever delivered it. He said he'd called the restaurant around 7 p.m. to complain, and they'd given him a refund and a credit for a free pizza. He seemed annoyed about the whole thing. But here's what really bothers me. Robert looked different, older somehow. When I mentioned that I'd delivered to him many times before, he said he'd never seen me in his life. He'd been living at that address for 30 years and always ordered from Tony's Pizza across town, never from our place. I checked our delivery records when I got back to work. According to our system, we'd never delivered to 1247 Maple Street before that day. No history of orders, no customer profile for Robert, nothing. But I have clear memories of delivering there dozens of times, always the same $3 tip, always the same questions about my family. The other drivers at work confirmed that they'd never delivered to that address either. They said Maple Street was outside our normal delivery zone and that they'd never even heard of anyone named Robert ordering from our store. I started questioning everything after that. I wrote down every detail I could remember about my previous deliveries to Robert's house. What he wore, what he said, what the inside of his house looked like when he opened the door. I had vivid, specific memories of at least 20 different interactions with him, but according to everyone else, none of it ever happened. The computer records, the security footage, my co-workers' memories, everything contradicted what I knew to be true. It was like those 6 hours existed in some alternate timeline that only I experienced. The strangest part is that I still have the pizza. It's been sitting in my freezer for 3 weeks now, and it's still as fresh as the day it was made. No freezer burn, no deterioration, like time stopped affecting it completely. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, trying to understand how something can exist as proof of an event that apparently never happened. I quit the delivery job last week because I couldn't handle the uncertainty anymore. Every time I drove past Maple Street, I'd see the houses that everyone else saw, but I'd also remember the empty lots I saw that night, like 2 different realities occupying the same space, and I was somehow caught between them. The missing 6 hours still bother me the most. Where did I go? What did I do? How did I experience something that left physical evidence, but no trace in anyone else's reality? I've started keeping a detailed journal of everything I do each day because I'm terrified of losing time again without realizing it. This story perfectly captures that unsettling feeling when your personal reality doesn't match the evidence around you. The detail about the pizza staying fresh for weeks is particularly haunting because it suggests those 6 hours existed in some kind of temporal bubble. The fact that Roberts had completely different memories and had apparently never met him before makes you wonder if the original timeline got overwritten somehow. It's the kind of experience that would make anyone question their grip on reality. Our next story involves someone who discovered that their childhood memories might not be as solid as they thought. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and like most kids, I spent countless hours exploring the neighborhood with my best friend Casey. We had this routine every summer where we'd ride our bikes to the old mill pond about half a mile from my house. It was our secret hideout, a place where we'd spend entire afternoons skipping stones and catching tadpoles. The mill pond was surrounded by these massive oak trees that had to be at least 100 years old. There was an old wooden dock that extended about 10 feet into the water, and we'd sit on the edge with our feet dangling in the cool water. The whole area felt magical to us as kids, like something out of a fairy tale. Casey and I probably visited that pond 3 or 4 times a week every summer for about 5 years, from when we were 8 until we were 13, and started getting interested in other things. We carved our initials into one of the oak trees, built a small fort out of fallen branches, and even buried a time capsule near the shore that we planned to dig up when we turned 18. When I was 25, I decided to move back to my hometown after finishing graduate school. I was feeling nostalgic and wanted to reconnect with my roots. One of the first things I planned to do was visit the old mill pond and maybe even look for that time capsule Casey and I had buried. I drove to where the pond should have been, following the same route I'd taken on my bike hundreds of times as a kid. I remembered every turn, every landmark, every detail of the journey. But when I got to the location, there was nothing there except an empty field. Not an empty lot where a pond had been drained, but a field that looked like it had been farmland for decades. There were no massive oak trees, no old dock, no mill pond, just corn growing in neat rows as far as I could see. I thought maybe I'd gotten confused about the location, so I drove around the entire area systematically. I checked every possible spot where the pond might have been, but found nothing. I even asked at the local gas station if they knew about any mill pond in the area. The clerk, who'd lived there his whole life, said there had never been any mill pond anywhere near town. Confused and a little upset, I decided to call Casey. We'd stayed in touch over the years, though not regularly. When I told him about trying to find the mill pond, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, Casey said, "What mill pond? I don't know what you're talking about." I started describing our childhood adventures there. The oak trees, the dock, our time capsule, the initials we'd carved. Casey listened patiently and then said, "I think you're confusing me with someone else. We never did any of that stuff together. I don't remember any pond." I was shocked. I started going through specific memories, trying to jog his memory. I reminded him about the day we saw a family of ducks swimming near the shore, about the time he fell off the dock and got his sneakers soaked, about the afternoon we spent collecting smooth stones to skip across the water. Casey sounded genuinely confused and a little concerned. He said, "I remember hanging out with you as kids, but we usually just played video games at your house or rode our bikes around the neighbourhood. I have no memory of any pond or any of the things you're describing." I hung up feeling completely disoriented. I had vivid, detailed memories of hundreds of hours spent at that mill pond. I could remember the smell of the water, the sound the wind made through the oak leaves, the feeling of the sun on my back as we sat on the dock, but apparently none of it ever happened. I called my parents and asked them about the mill pond. They said they'd never heard of any mill pond near our house. When I described the location, my dad said that area had been farmland for as long as he could remember, probably since before the town was founded. Desperate for some kind of confirmation, I went to the local library and looked through old maps and historical records. I found maps dating back to the 1800s, and none of them showed any mill or pond in that area. The land had been consistently used for agriculture for over 150 years. I even found old aerial photographs from the 1960s and 1970s that clearly showed farmland, where I remembered the pond being. There were no oak trees, no water, no mill structure. Just fields that looked exactly like what I'd found when I went looking for the pond. The most unsettling part was how real those memories still felt. I could close my eyes and picture every detail of that place. I could remember conversations Casey and I had while sitting on the dock, specific days when the weather was perfect or when we got caught in sudden rainstorms. I could remember the taste of the sandwiches my mum packed for our pond adventures, but I was apparently the only person who remembered any of it. Casey, my parents, the town records, everything contradicted what I knew with absolute certainty had been a huge part of my childhood. I started questioning other memories from that time period. I wondered what else might be false, what other experiences I'd somehow fabricated or imagined. But all my other childhood memories checked out. Friends remembered the same events I did. Photographs confirmed things that happened. Everything else aligned with reality. It was just the mill pond that didn't exist, along with years of memories associated with it. Like someone had surgically removed that one location from reality, but left all the memories intact in my mind. I've been back to my hometown several times since then, and I always drive by that cornfield. Sometimes I'll park and walk to the exact spot where I remember the dock extending into the water. I'll stand there and try to reconcile what I see with what I remember, but I never can. The strangest thing is that I still miss that place. I miss sitting by the water with Casey. I miss the peace I felt there. I miss the sense of adventure we had, exploring every inch of that pond. How can you miss a place that never existed? How can you grieve for experiences that apparently never happened? I've never found any explanation for what happened to those memories, or why they feel so real when they're clearly impossible. All I know is that somewhere in my mind there's still a perfect mill pond surrounded by ancient oak trees. And somewhere in that pond there's still a time capsule waiting to be discovered by two kids who apparently never existed there at all. That story hits differently because childhood memories feel so foundational to who we are as people. The idea that years of formative experiences could be completely fabricated is terrifying on a deep level. What's particularly disturbing is how the memory stayed vivid and detailed even when confronted with overwhelming evidence that it never happened. It makes you wonder how many of our core memories might be unreliable and what that means for our sense of identity and personal history. Let's continue with another story that explores the boundaries between memory and reality. I've been a librarian at the same public library for 12 years. It's a small branch in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where the most exciting thing that happens is when someone returns a book late or we get a new shipment of bestsellers. I know every regular patron, every section of books, every creaky floorboard in the building. At least, I thought I did. About 2 months ago, I started noticing a patron I'd never seen before. She was probably in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and always wearing cardigans in different pastel colours. She'd come in every Tuesday and Thursday around 10 a.m, always heading straight to the mystery section in the back corner. What caught my attention was her routine. She'd spend exactly 45 minutes browsing, always selecting 3 books, and then she'd sit at the same table near the window to flip through them before checking out. She was quiet and polite, never caused any problems, just a typical library patron. The thing that started bothering me was that I couldn't find any record of her in our system. Every time she checked out books, I'd look up her library card number, but there was no account associated with it. The card itself looked official, had our library's logo and everything, but when I scanned it, nothing would come up on the computer. I assumed it was some kind of technical glitch. Maybe her account got corrupted or accidentally deleted. I kept meaning to ask her about it, but she was always so efficient with her visits that I never found the right moment to bring it up. After about 6 weeks of seeing her regularly, I decided to check our patron database more thoroughly. I searched by name, by address, by phone number, every possible way to find her account. I even looked through our old paper records from before we went digital. Nothing. It was like she'd never registered for a library card at all. But she kept coming in, kept checking out books with that mysterious card that worked perfectly fine despite not existing in our system. I started paying closer attention to her selections. Always mystery novels, always authors I'd never heard of, always books that looked brand new despite our mystery section, being filled mostly with worn paperbacks that had been in circulation for years. One Thursday, I decided to follow up on the books she'd returned the previous Tuesday. I wanted to see what she'd been reading, maybe get some insight into who she was. I went to the mystery section to look for the 3 books she'd brought back, but I couldn't find them anywhere. I checked the returns bin, the reshelving cart, even the repair pile where we put damaged books. Nothing. It was like the books had simply vanished after she returned them. I searched our catalogue to see if we even owned the titles she'd been checking out, but none of them were in our system. The next Tuesday, I was ready for her. When she came to check out her usual 3 books, I asked to see the titles. The first one was The Vanishing Hour by someone named Margaret Whitfield. The second was Midnight in Millbrook by Thomas Hartwell. The third was The Last Detective by Caroline Rivers. I'd been a librarian for over a decade and prided myself on knowing mystery authors, but I'd never heard of any of these writers. The books themselves looked professionally published, with proper ISBN numbers and everything, but when I tried to look them up online later, I couldn't find any information about the authors or the books. After she left, I decided to follow her. I told my assistant I was taking a short break and walked outside just in time to see her getting into an old blue sedan. I followed at a distance, curious about where she lived, maybe planning to do a wellness check if she was having memory issues that explained the library card situation. She drove about 10 minutes to a residential neighbourhood I knew well. I'd grown up in this town and thought I knew every street, every house, but she pulled into the driveway of a house I'd never seen before. It was a small yellow cottage with white trim, nestled between 2 houses I definitely recognised. The weird thing was, I was absolutely certain there had never been a house in that spot. The 2 neighbouring houses had always been next to each other, with just a narrow strip of grass between them where kids sometimes played. But now, there was this cottage sitting there, like it had always belonged. I parked across the street and watched as she went inside. The house looked lived in, with curtains in the windows and a small garden in front. There was even a mailbox with a name on it that I couldn't quite read from my distance. Everything about it seemed normal, except for the fact that it had somehow appeared in a space that had been empty my entire life. I drove back to the library, feeling completely disoriented. That evening, I called my friend Rachel, who lived just 2 streets over from where I'd followed the mysterious patron. I asked her casually if she knew anything about the yellow cottage on Elm Street. Rachel said, "What yellow cottage? There's no yellow cottage on Elm Street, just the Johnson's house and the Miller's house, and they've always been right next to each other." I described exactly where I'd seen the cottage, but Rachel insisted there was nothing there. She said she walked her dog past that spot every day and there had never been any house between those 2 properties. The next day, I drove back to Elm Street during my lunch break. The cottage was gone. The Johnson's house and the Miller's house were sitting next to each other, just like Rachel had described, with only a narrow strip of grass between them. No cottage, no garden, no mailbox. But I knew what I'd seen. I had clear memories of watching the elderly woman unlock the front door and go inside. I remembered the colour of the trim, the flowers in the garden, even the way the afternoon sunlight hit the windows. When Thursday came around, I was anxious to see if the mystery patron would show up again. She did, right on schedule, same routine as always. This time, I was ready with questions. When she came to check out her books, I asked her directly, "I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble with our computer system. Could you tell me your name and address so I can look up your account manually?" She smiled politely and said, "Oh, I don't have an account here. I use the travelling collection." I asked her what she meant by travelling collection, and she explained that there was a special program for elderly patrons where books were delivered to their homes and they could return them to any participating library. She said she'd been part of the program for years. I'd never heard of any such program, and I would have known about it as a staff member. But she seemed so certain, so matter-of-fact about it, that I started doubting my own knowledge of our library's services. After she left, I called the main branch and asked about any travelling collection or home delivery program. They had no idea what I was talking about. I called the county library system, the state library association, even some neighbouring library systems. Nobody had ever heard of a travelling collection program like what she'd described. That was 3 weeks ago. She hasn't been back since. The mystery section feels different now, like something important is missing. I keep expecting to see her on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but the table by the window stays empty. I've driven past Elm Street several more times, but I never see the yellow cottage. Just the two houses with their strip of grass, exactly like it's always been. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but I still have the mental image of that cottage burned into my memory. The strangest part is that I miss her, even though I never knew her name or had a real conversation with her. There was something comforting about her routine, her quiet presence in the library. Now that she's gone, I realise how much her mysterious visits had become part of my own routine. I still check our system every few days, hoping to find some record of her, some explanation for how she could check out books that didn't exist with a library card that wasn't in our database. But there's nothing. It's like she was never there at all, except for the fact that I remember her so clearly. Sometimes, I wonder if she'll come back, if I'll see her again browsing the mystery section with her careful, methodical approach to book selection. But I have a feeling that whatever door she walked through to reach our library has closed permanently, and I'll never understand what I witnessed during those 8 weeks when reality seemed to bend around one elderly woman and her impossible books. That story gives me chills because libraries are supposed to be such grounded, orderly places where everything has a system and makes sense. The idea of someone existing in the gaps of that system, checking out books that don't exist with credentials that don't work, feels like a glitch in the most fundamental kind of reality. The disappearing house just makes it even more unsettling, like she existed in some parallel version of the town that occasionally overlapped with the real one. Here's our next story from someone who discovered that their daily commute might not be as predictable as they thought. I take the same train to work every morning. The 7:42 Red Line from Porter Station into downtown Boston. I've been making this exact commute for 4 years, and I know it like clockwork. 23 minutes, door to door, 8 stops, same routine every single weekday. The train is usually pretty crowded during rush hour, but I've learned to position myself on the platform so I can get a seat in the third car from the front. There's this one spot by the window where I sit every day, and I've gotten to recognise the other regular commuters who have their own preferred seats and routines. 3 months ago, something changed, but it took me weeks to realise what was happening. It started with small things that I dismissed as tiredness or not paying attention. I'd look up from my phone and notice we were passing stations in the wrong order, or we'd arrive at my stop earlier or later than usual. At first I figured maybe they'd changed the schedule or the route without much notice. Transportation systems update their operations all the time. But when I checked the official MBTA website and asked at the station, everyone insisted nothing had changed about the Red Line schedule or stops. Then I started keeping track more carefully. I'd write down the time we left Porter, which stops we hit, and when we arrived downtown. Some days, everything was exactly as it should be. But other days we'd skip stations that should have been on our route, or stop at stations that didn't exist on any map I could find. The most confusing part was that none of the other passengers seemed to notice anything unusual. When we'd pull into a station I'd never seen before, people would get on and off like it was completely normal. The conductor would announce station names that weren't on any Red Line map, but everyone acted like they belonged there. One morning, we stopped at a station called Riverside Gardens. I'd been riding the Red Line for 4 years and had never heard of this stop. I looked around at the other passengers to see if anyone else was confused, but they were all just reading their phones or newspapers, like nothing was wrong. I got off at Riverside Gardens just to see what was there. The platform looked like all the other Red Line stations, with the same tiles and signage. But when I went upstairs, I found myself in a neighbourhood I'd never seen before. Victorian houses lined quiet tree-covered streets, and there was a small town square with shops that looked like they'd been there for decades. I walked around for about 20 minutes, trying to figure out where I was. I asked a woman walking her dog what neighbourhood this was, and she said, Riverside Gardens, like it was obvious. When I asked her how to get to downtown Boston, she pointed back toward the train station and said the Red Line would take me right there. I went back down to the platform and caught the next train. 15 minutes later, I was at my usual stop downtown, right on schedule. When I looked at the official MBTA map later that day, there was no Riverside Gardens station listed anywhere on the Red Line or any other line. This started happening more frequently. Some mornings my train would take the normal route with the expected stops. Other mornings, we'd detour through stations that shouldn't exist, travelling through parts of the city I'd never seen, despite living in Boston for over a decade. I tried talking to other passengers about it, but they'd look at me like I was crazy. One man I'd seen on my train hundreds of times insisted we were on the green line, not the red line, even though we were clearly on a red line train, with red line signage everywhere. Another morning, we stopped at a station called Millfield Junction. When I got off to explore, I found myself in what looked like a small New England town from the 1950s. There was a diner with a neon sign, a movie theatre showing films I'd never heard of, and cars parked on the street that looked like they belonged in a museum. I asked the diner waitress what year it was, and she said 2024, same as always. But everything around me looked decades older. The newspaper on the counter had today's date, but was full of stories about local events and people I'd never heard of, as if I was reading about a completely different version of the world. The strangest part was that I started looking forward to these detours. The alternate stations were always interesting, always somewhere I'd never been before. I'd get off and explore for 20 or 30 minutes, then catch the next train and arrive at work, only slightly late. My boss never seemed to notice when I came in late on these mornings, which was unusual because she was normally very strict about punctuality. When I mentioned being delayed by train issues, she'd just nod and move on, like it was perfectly normal. After about 2 months of this, I decided to take pictures and videos of the alternate stations to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. But whenever I tried to use my phone camera at these mysterious stops, the screen would go black or the photos would come out completely corrupted. Last week, something different happened. Instead of stopping at an unknown station, the train just kept going past my usual downtown stop. We travelled for what felt like hours through underground tunnels I'd never seen before, past stations with names in languages I couldn't identify. The other passengers didn't seem concerned. They sat quietly, reading or sleeping like this was a normal commute. When I asked the conductor where we were going, he said, "End of the line, just like always." Eventually, we emerged from underground into daylight, and I could see we were in countryside I didn't recognise. Rolling hills, farmland, small villages in the distance, nothing that looks like it could be anywhere near Boston. The train finally stopped at a station that was just a simple platform in the middle of nowhere. The sign said "Last Stop" in plain black letters. All the other passengers got off and walked away across a field toward a cluster of buildings on the horizon. I stayed on the train, too scared to get off in a place I didn't recognise. After about 10 minutes, the doors closed and we started moving again. This time, we went directly back to my usual downtown stop, with no other stops in between. The whole trip took exactly 23 minutes. Same as always, when I got to work I checked the time and realised I'd arrived at exactly my normal time, despite feeling like I'd been on that train for hours. My phone showed I'd sent my usual running on time text to my boss at 7:45, but I had no memory of sending it. That was a week ago. Since then, every train ride has been completely normal. Regular stops, regular schedule, regular route. But I keep waiting for another detour, another glimpse of those impossible places that exist somewhere along the Red Line's secret routes. I've started carrying a notebook instead of relying on my phone, hoping to document the next time reality decides to take a detour. But part of me wonders if those alternate stations were showing me something important, some hidden layer of the city that most people never get to see. I still take the 7:42 train every morning, still sit in the same seat in the third car. But now, I pay attention to every station, every turn, every moment when the familiar might suddenly become impossible, because I know that somewhere out there, beyond the official maps and schedules, There are places that exist only for travellers willing to notice when their routine becomes extraordinary. That story perfectly captures the anxiety and wonder of discovering that something as mundane as your daily commute might be connected to hidden worlds. There's something both terrifying and magical about the idea that public transportation could occasionally slip between realities, carrying unsuspecting passengers to places that shouldn't exist. The detail about other passengers acting completely normal while visiting impossible locations makes you wonder how many people might be living parallel experiences without realizing it. Let's move into our next story about someone who found out their neighborhood had some very unusual properties. I've lived in the same neighborhood for 15 years, a quiet residential area about 30 minutes outside Portland. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other. Kids ride their bikes safely down tree-lined streets, and the biggest excitement is usually someone's garage sale or a new family moving in. I thought I knew every house, every street corner, every shortcut through the area, until I started noticing things that didn't make sense. It began about 6 months ago, when I was walking my dog Rex on our usual evening route. We always take the same path. Down Birch Street, left on Maple Avenue, around the small park at the end of the block, then back home via Oak Drive. It's a 20-minute walk that we've done almost every night for years. But that Tuesday evening, something was different. When we turned left onto what should have been Maple Avenue, the street looked completely wrong. Instead of the familiar row of colonial-style houses with their neat front lawns, there was a street I'd never seen before. The houses were older, Victorian-era homes with elaborate gingerbread trim and wraparound porches. The street sign still said Maple Avenue, but everything else was completely different. I stood there confused, wondering if I'd somehow gotten turned around. But I could see Birch Street behind me, and the park was still visible at the end of the block where it should be. It was definitely Maple Avenue, but it was like someone had replaced every single house overnight. Rex didn't seem bothered by the change. He sniffed around the new sidewalk like he'd been walking this route his entire life. When we passed one of the Victorian houses, an elderly woman sitting on the porch waved and called out, "Good evening, Tom. How's Rex doing tonight?" I waved back automatically, but I'd never seen this woman before in my life. She knew my name and my dog's name, but I had no idea who she was. When I got home, I asked my wife Linda if she knew anything about construction or renovation work happening on Maple Avenue. Linda looked at me strangely and said, "What are you talking about? Maple Avenue has always had those Victorian houses. The Hendersons live in the blue one. The Patels are in the yellow one, with the big porch. You've been walking past them for 15 years. I was completely baffled. I had clear memories of the colonial houses that had been there the day before, but Linda was describing the Victorian houses I'd just seen. When I insisted that the street had changed, she suggested maybe I was just tired and not paying attention. The next evening, I took the same route deliberately, paying close attention to every detail. The Victorian houses were still there, looking like they'd been part of the neighbourhood for decades. The elderly woman was on her porch again and waved like we were old friends. This time, I stopped to talk to her. I asked how long she'd lived in the neighbourhood, and she said 43 years. She mentioned watching me move in 15 years ago, and how much she'd enjoyed seeing Rex grow from a puppy into such a well-behaved dog. I asked her about the houses that used to be on this street, trying to describe the colonial-style homes I remembered. She looked confused and said the Victorian houses had been there since the neighbourhood was built in the 1920s. She even offered to show me old photographs that proved it. When I got home, I went through my own photo albums looking for pictures that might show Maple Avenue in the background. I found several photos from neighbourhood barbecues and block parties over the years. In every single photo, the Victorian houses were clearly visible. There was no sign of the colonial houses I distinctly remembered. But the really strange part was that I could remember taking some of these photos myself, and in my memory, the colonial houses had been in the background. Now the same photos showed Victorian houses, but I had clear recollections of both versions. I started paying attention to other streets in the neighbourhood, wondering if more changes were happening that I wasn't noticing. Most everything looked exactly as it should, but occasionally I'd spot something that seemed wrong. A house painted a different colour than I remembered. A tree that was suddenly much larger or smaller than it should be. A driveway on the wrong side of a property. The changes were subtle and infrequent, but once I started looking for them, I couldn't stop. It was like the neighbourhood was slowly shifting around me, one small detail at a time. The worst part was that everyone else seemed to remember things the way they were now, not the way I remembered them being before. 3 months ago, I decided to test something. I started taking daily photos of our street from my front porch, creating a visual record that couldn't be influenced by faulty memory. For weeks, everything stayed consistent. Then one morning, I looked at the previous day's photo and noticed that the Johnsons' house across the street was white with blue trim, instead of the yellow with green trim that I'd photographed. I went outside to check, and sure enough, the house was white with blue trim. It looked like it had been painted that way for years. When I asked my neighbour if the Johnsons had recently painted their house, he said it had always been white and blue, and that he'd complimented them on that exact colour scheme when they moved in 8 years ago, but I had a photo from the day before showing it as yellow and green. When I showed the photo to my neighbour, he looked at the screen and said, "Yeah, that's exactly what their house looks like, white with blue trim, just like I said." I was looking at a photo that clearly showed yellow and green, but he was seeing white and blue. Either my camera was malfunctioning in impossible ways, or we were looking at the same image and seeing completely different things. I started showing the photos to other neighbours, and everyone saw different things. Mrs. Peterson saw a red house with white trim. The teenage kid from down the street saw a grey house with black shutters. Everyone was confident about what they were seeing, but nobody was seeing the same thing. That's when I realised the changes weren't just happening to the neighbourhood, they were happening to perception itself. Reality was shifting, but it was shifting differently for each person. We were all living in slightly different versions of the same place, and somehow my awareness of the changes was making me see the inconsistencies. Last month, I decided to walk a completely different route to see if the phenomenon was limited to my usual path. I headed toward the commercial district, about a mile away. Taking streets I rarely used, everything looked normal until I reached what should have been Main Street. Instead of the familiar strip of shops and restaurants, I found myself looking at a street I'd never seen before. There was an old-fashioned soda fountain, a bookstore with hand-painted signs, and a hardware store that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. The street sign said Main Street, but it was like I'd stepped back in time 50 years. I went into the soda fountain and ordered a Coke. The teenage girl behind the counter was wearing a uniform that looked vintage, and she served the drink in a glass bottle with a paper straw. When I asked what year it was, she looked at me strangely and said 2024. I paid with a credit card, and she ran it through a modern payment terminal, but everything else about the place felt like it was from a different era. The music playing was from the 1950s. The customers were dressed in clothing that seemed slightly out of time, and even the light coming through the windows had a different quality to it. When I walked back home, I took the exact same route I'd used to get there. But when I reached the spot where Main Street should be, I found the familiar strip of modern shops and chain restaurants. The soda fountain was gone, replaced by a Starbucks that had been there for as long as I could remember. I've stopped trying to make sense of what's happening to my neighbourhood. I've accepted that I'm living in a place where reality is fluid, where streets can change their architecture overnight, and everyone remembers things differently. The strange part is that I'm starting to enjoy the unpredictability of it. Every walk with Rex has become an adventure. I never know if we'll take our familiar route through the neighbourhood I've known for 15 years, or if we'll discover new streets that exist in the spaces between what used to be and what might become. Sometimes I think I'm losing my mind, but most of the time I feel like I'm the only one who gets to see all the different versions of home that exist simultaneously in the same space. Yesterday, I found a street that wasn't on any map, lined with houses that looked like they were made of candy and gingerbread. An old man sitting in a rocking chair waved and called me by name, even though I'd never seen him before. Rex wagged his tail, like he'd known the man his whole life. We walked down that impossible street for 20 minutes, past houses that defied physics and gardens that bloomed with flowers I couldn't name. When we turned the corner to head home, we were back on familiar Oak Drive, walking past the same houses we'd seen 1,000 times before. But now I know that somewhere behind the ordinary facades, there are Victorian mansions and candy houses and streets that exist only for people willing to notice when their neighbourhood decides to reveal its secrets. That story ends there. The idea of living in a place where reality constantly shifts but only you can see the changes is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. What really gets me is how everyone else sees different versions of the same photos, like they're all trapped in their own individual versions of reality, while he's somehow aware of all of them. The neighbourhood becoming this fluid, dreamlike space where anything is possible sounds amazing until you realise you'd never be able to trust your own perception of home again. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their daily routine at work had some very unexpected interruptions. I work as a security guard at a large office complex downtown. It's a pretty standard job, mostly just sitting at the front desk, checking IDs and signing in visitors during business hours. The building houses about 15 different companies, everything from law firms to marketing agencies to tech startups. I've been working this job for 3 years, and I know the routine of every regular employee who comes through those doors. The building is supposed to be completely empty after 9 p.m, except for security staff and the occasional employee working late. We do hourly rounds through all 12 floors, checking that doors are locked and everything is secure. It's usually quiet work, just me and whoever's working the overnight cleaning crew. About 4 months ago, I started noticing something odd during my late night rounds. On the 7th floor, which houses a consulting firm called Bradley & Associates, I kept hearing sounds coming from the conference room. Voices having what sounded like meetings, papers shuffling, the occasional laugh or heated discussion. The first few times it happened, I assumed someone was working late and had forgotten to sign in with security. But when I checked the room, it was always empty. The lights would be off, chairs pushed in around the conference table, no signs that anyone had been there recently. I started paying closer attention during my rounds. The sounds were definitely coming from that specific conference room, and they followed a pattern. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, around 11:30 p.m, I'd hear what sounded like a full business meeting in progress. Voices I didn't recognise discussing projects and deadlines, and quarterly reports. The voices were clear enough that I could make out individual words and phrases. I'd hear someone say things like, "We need to increase our market penetration in the Northeast region," or "The Johnson account is 3 weeks behind schedule." It sounded like a completely normal corporate meeting, except it was happening in an empty room in the middle of the night. I tried different approaches to figure out what was going on. I'd stand outside the door and listen for several minutes, then quickly unlock and open the door to catch whoever was inside. But every time, the room was empty and silent the moment I opened the door. I checked with the daytime security staff to see if Bradley & Associates had any employees who regularly worked late or had access to hold meetings after hours. According to our records, no one from that company had badge access outside of normal business hours, and the cleaning crew confirmed they never saw anyone on the 7th floor during their nighttime shifts. The really strange part was that I could hear these meetings happening while I was doing other parts of my rounds. If I was on the 5th floor checking doors, I could sometimes hear the murmur of voices drifting down from the 7th floor conference room. But by the time I got upstairs, everything would be quiet. After about 6 weeks of this, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to catch them in the act, I hid a small digital recorder in the conference room before my shift started. I figured if there really were people having meetings, the recorder would pick up their voices. And if I was imagining things, it would just record silence. The next morning, I retrieved the recorder and played back the 8 hours of audio. For most of the recording, it was just the ambient sounds you'd expect from an empty office building. But right around 11:30 p.m, clear as day, I could hear voices having a detailed business meeting. I listened to the entire 45-minute meeting. They discussed budget allocations, staffing changes, and upcoming client presentations. The voices sounded professional and knowledgeable, like people who had been working together for years. But none of the voices belonged to anyone I'd ever met during my 3 years working in this building. I took the recording to my supervisor, thinking maybe there was some explanation I wasn't aware of. Maybe Bradley and Associates had some kind of special arrangement for after-hours meetings that security hadn't been informed about. But when my supervisor called the company's main office, they insisted that no one from their firm had been in the building after 6 p.m. in months. The office manager at Bradley and Associates was actually concerned that someone might be using their conference room without authorization. She asked us to increase security checks on the 7th floor and to call the police if we found any unauthorized people in their space. So now I had official authorization to investigate these mysterious meetings more aggressively. The next Tuesday night, I positioned myself outside the conference room at 11:25 p.m. with a flashlight and master keys, ready to confront whoever was inside. Right on schedule, I started hearing voices. This time, I could make out more details because I was listening carefully from just outside the door. I heard a woman's voice saying, "The Peterson merger needs to be finalized by Friday, or we'll lose the deal to our competitors." A man's voice responded, "I'll need at least 6 more hours of legal review before we can proceed." I waited until I was sure the meeting was in full swing, then quickly unlocked the door and burst in with my flashlight. The room was completely empty. No people, no papers on the table, no sign that anyone had been there. But I could swear I heard footsteps and the sound of chairs being pushed back, like people had just gotten up and left through a door that didn't exist. I searched the entire 7th floor, checking every office, every closet, every possible place someone could hide. I found nothing. The elevator logs showed no activity, the stairwell doors were all locked from the inside, and there were no other ways to access or leave that floor. But the strangest part was what happened when I went back to the conference room. As I was standing there trying to make sense of what I had experienced, I heard one final voice, very faint, like someone whispering from very far away. It said, "Same time Thursday night, everyone. Thanks for staying late." Then complete silence, not even the usual ambient sounds of the building's HVAC system, just absolute quiet that felt heavy and unnatural. I started researching the history of the building and Bradley and Associates. What I found explained a lot, but also made everything more confusing. The building had been constructed in 1987, but Bradley and Associates had never actually rented space on the 7th floor. According to the building's leasing records, they'd been located on the 3rd floor since they moved in 8 years ago, but when I checked the 3rd floor, there was no sign of Bradley and Associates. The directory in the lobby listed them on the 7th floor, and that's where I'd been hearing the meetings, yet the official lease documents clearly showed them on the 3rd floor, in a space that was currently occupied by a different company entirely. I asked the building manager about the discrepancy, and she looked confused. She checked her records and confirmed that Bradley and Associates was listed as a 7th floor tenant, but she couldn't explain why the lease documents showed something different. She said she'd been managing the building for 12 years and had always known them to be on the 7th floor. Last week I decided to attend one of the mysterious meetings instead of trying to interrupt it. I sat quietly outside the conference room door and listened to the entire discussion. They talked about projects I'd never heard of, mentioned employees whose names weren't in any company directory, and discussed business strategies for markets that didn't seem to exist. At the end of the meeting, I heard someone say, "Before we adjourn, I want to address the security situation. I think we all know that someone has been trying to monitor our meetings. While we appreciate the diligence of the overnight staff, these discussions are confidential and we need to maintain our privacy." Another voice added, Perhaps it's time we considered relocating our after-hours meetings to a more secure location. The 7th floor has served us well, but we may have outgrown this arrangement. I haven't heard any meetings since then. The 7th floor conference room has been completely silent during my rounds for the past week. But sometimes, when I'm doing paperwork at the security desk, I'll look up at the building directory and notice that Bradley and Associates is no longer listed anywhere. Then I'll blink, and it's back on the 7th floor, like it never disappeared. I still do my rounds every night, and I still check that conference room twice per shift. Part of me hopes to hear those voices again, to get another glimpse into whatever business was being conducted in that impossible space between the official records and the building's actual tenants. But mostly, I'm relieved that I no longer have to explain to my supervisor why I keep filing reports about meetings that don't officially exist in a company that may or may not actually be located where everyone thinks it is. That story is over. The idea of phantom business meetings happening in empty conference rooms is somehow both mundane and terrifying at the same time. What really bothers me is how the company existed in the building directory, but not in the lease records, like reality couldn't decide where they actually belonged. The fact that they seemed aware of being monitored and decided to relocate their impossible meetings makes you wonder how many other businesses might be operating in the spaces between what's officially documented and what actually exists. Let's continue with a story about someone who found that their morning coffee routine led to some very unexpected discoveries. I work as a barista at a small independent coffee shop called The Daily Grind. We're located in a busy downtown area, and we get a steady stream of regular customers who come in at the same time every day for their usual orders. I've been working there for 2 years, and I pride myself on remembering everyone's preferences. The businessman who wants a double-shot Americano at exactly 7:15 a.m. The college student who orders a vanilla latte with oat milk every Tuesday and Thursday. The elderly woman who comes in for decaf and a blueberry muffin at 9:30 sharp. About 3 months ago, I started noticing a new regular customer. He was probably in his 40s, always wore a grey wool coat, and ordered the same thing every morning. Medium dark roast black, no sugar. He'd come in around 8 a.m, pay with exact change, and leave without saying much beyond "thank you." What made him memorable wasn't his order or his routine, but the fact that he aged visibly every day. Not gradually like normal people, but noticeably. The first day I served him, he looked like he was in his early 40s. By the end of the first week, he looked closer to 50. After 2 weeks, he appeared to be in his 60s, with grey hair and deep wrinkles around his eyes. I thought maybe I was just paying more attention to details I'd missed initially. Or perhaps he was going through a stressful period that was taking a physical toll. But the changes were too dramatic and consistent to be normal aging or stress-related deterioration. By the 3rd week, he looked like he was in his 70s. His hair had turned completely white, his back was more hunched, and he moved with the careful, measured steps of someone much older than the man who'd first walked into our shop. But he still ordered the same coffee, still paid with exact change, still followed the exact same routine. I started asking my co-workers if they'd noticed anything unusual about the man in the grey coat. My colleague Rachel said she'd seen him a few times but hadn't noticed anything strange. When I described how he seemed to be aging rapidly, she looked at me like I was losing my mind. The next morning, I made a point of paying close attention when he came in. He now looked to be in his 80s, walking with a slight shuffle and speaking in a voice that was noticeably weaker than it had been a month earlier. I served him his usual coffee and watched as he carefully counted out the exact change, with hands that trembled slightly. After he left, I asked Rachel to describe what she'd seen. She said she'd served a man who looked to be about 45, wearing a grey coat, nothing unusual about him at all. She described the same customer I'd just served, but she was seeing him as he'd appeared on his first day, not as the elderly man I was watching age in real time. I decided to take photos discreetly over the next few days to document what I was seeing. But every photo came out showing the same middle-aged man from his first visit. The camera wasn't capturing the aging process that I could see clearly with my own eyes. 2 months into this bizarre routine, the man looked ancient. He had to be helped to the counter by other customers. His voice was barely a whisper, and it took him several minutes to count out his change with shaking hands. I was watching someone deteriorate before my eyes, but apparently I was the only one who could see it happening. Last Tuesday, he came in looking frailer than I'd ever seen him. He could barely stand upright, and his voice was so weak I had to lean across the counter to hear his order. I prepared his medium dark roast and watched as he struggled to lift the cup. His hands were shaking so badly that I was afraid he'd spill the hot coffee on himself. As he turned to leave, he stopped and looked directly at me. In a voice that was barely audible, he said, "Thank you for seeing me, as I really am. Most people only see what they expect to see, but you've been watching me disappear day by day. I appreciate that someone noticed." Then he walked slowly toward the door, each step looking like it required enormous effort. Just before he reached the exit, he turned back one more time and said, "I won't be coming in tomorrow." That was a week ago. He hasn't been back since. I keep expecting to see him shuffle through the door at 8 a.m, but his spot in line remains empty. My co-workers occasionally ask if I've seen that middle-aged guy in the grey coat lately, still describing him as he appeared on his first day, completely unaware of the months-long process of deterioration I witnessed. The strangest part is that I miss him, even though our interactions were brief and mostly professional. There was something profound about being the only person who could see what was happening to him, the only witness to whatever process was causing him to age decades in a matter of weeks. I've started paying closer attention to all our regular customers, wondering if there are other people experiencing impossible changes that only certain observers can detect. So far, everyone else appears to be aging normally, following the predictable patterns of time that make sense in our ordinary world. But sometimes, when I'm making coffee in the early morning hours, I find myself glancing toward the door at 8 a.m, hoping to see a familiar grey coat, and knowing that I'll never understand what I witnessed or why I was chosen to see it, while everyone else remained blind to the man who was disappearing one cup of coffee at a time. That story is finished. The image of someone aging decades in weeks while only one person can witness it is absolutely haunting. There's something deeply sad about being the sole observer of someone's deterioration, especially when they acknowledge that you're the only one who truly sees them. The fact that he thanked her for witnessing his disappearance makes it even more poignant, like being seen was all he really wanted before fading away completely. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their apartment building had some very unusual architectural features. I live in a converted warehouse apartment building in Chicago. It's one of those trendy loft spaces with exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and industrial fixtures. The building has 6 floors with about 8 units per floor, and I've been living on the 4th floor for about 18 months. The layout is pretty straightforward. There's a central elevator and stairwell, with apartments branching off a main hallway on each floor. My unit is 4C, right in the middle of the hallway, between 4B and 4D. I know the building well because I jog the stairwells for exercise, and I've helped neighbours move furniture up and down the floors. 3 weeks ago, I was coming home late from work and decided to take the stairs instead of waiting for the slow elevator. I climbed up to what I thought was the 4th floor, but when I stepped into the hallway, something was completely wrong. Instead of the familiar hallway with its polished concrete floors and modern lighting, I found myself in a corridor that looked like it belonged in an old hotel from the 1940s. The floors were covered in worn carpet with an intricate pattern. The walls were papered with faded floral designs, and the lighting came from vintage sconces that cast a warm, yellow glow. The apartment numbers were different too. Instead of the simple black numbers on each door, there were brass plates with ornate numbering systems. Where my apartment 4C should have been, there was a door marked Suite 47 in elaborate script lettering. I stood there completely confused, wondering if I'd somehow gotten off on the wrong floor. But when I looked back at the stairwell, the door clearly marked 4 in the same modern font used throughout the building. I was definitely on the 4th floor, but it was like someone had redecorated the entire hallway while I was at work. I walked back to the stairwell and went down 1 floor, then back up, thinking maybe I'd made some kind of mistake. But when I emerged from the stairwell again, I was back in the familiar, modern hallway with polished concrete and my apartment 4C exactly where it should be. I unlocked my door and went inside, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The vintage hallway had felt completely real, not like a hallucination or a trick of the light. I could smell the old carpet and hear different sounds coming from behind the ornate doors, like music from another era playing softly in the background. The next morning, I asked my neighbour in 4B if she'd noticed anything unusual about the hallway recently. She looked at me strangely and said everything had been exactly the same since she moved in 2 years ago. I described the vintage hotel corridor I'd seen, but she had no idea what I was talking about. I decided to test this systematically. For the next week, I came home at different times and always took the stairs to the 4th floor. Most of the time, I found the normal modern hallway I expected, but occasionally, maybe one time out of every 4 or 5 trips, I'd step into the vintage hotel corridor instead. The pattern seemed random at first, but I started keeping notes about when it happened. The vintage hallway appeared most often late at night, usually after 10 p.m, and almost never during daylight hours. It was like the building had 2 different versions of the 4th floor that existed in the same physical space, but at different times. On the nights when I encountered the hotel hallway, I started exploring more thoroughly. I'd walk the full length of the corridor, examining the brass nameplates and listening to the sounds coming from behind each door. Suite 47, where my apartment should be, always had soft jazz music playing inside. Suite 45 had the sound of typewriter keys clicking steadily. Suite 49 had what sounded like a dinner party in progress, with conversation and clinking glasses. I tried knocking on Suite 47 once, thinking maybe I could get inside and see what version of my apartment existed in this alternate hallway. After a few moments, I heard footsteps approaching the door, and a woman's voice called out, "Who is it?" I didn't know what to say, so I responded with my name. The voice said, "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong room. There's no one here by that name." When I explained that this was my apartment, there was a long silence before she said, "This is Suite 47. I've been living here for 3 years. You must be looking for someone else." I tried explaining about apartment 4C and the modern building layout, but the woman behind the door sounded increasingly confused and concerned. Finally, she said she was going to call the front desk if I didn't leave immediately. I went back to the stairwell, and when I emerged again, I was in the familiar modern hallway. I unlocked apartment 4C with my regular key and went inside to find everything exactly as I'd left it. 2 weeks ago, I encountered something new. Instead of finding either the modern hallway or the vintage hotel corridor, I stepped out of the stairwell into what looked like an unfinished construction zone. The walls were bare concrete. There were construction materials scattered around, and exposed electrical wiring hung from the ceiling. The apartment doors were just rough openings covered with plastic sheeting. I could hear construction sounds coming from behind the plastic barriers, hammering, drilling, workers calling to each other, but when I checked the building directory later, there was no record of any construction or renovation work being done on the 4th floor. The construction version of the hallway appeared 3 more times over the following week, always late at night when the sounds of work seemed particularly loud and active. I started wondering if I was seeing the building at different points in its timeline, the construction phase, the vintage hotel period, and the current modern apartments. Last Friday night, I encountered a 4th version of the hallway that I'd never seen before. This time, it looked abandoned and run down. The walls were water-stained and cracking. The ceiling tiles were missing in several places, and there was debris scattered across the floor. The apartment doors were boarded up with warnings about structural damage and safety hazards. I walked carefully down this deteriorating hallway, stepping around fallen ceiling tiles and pools of water from what appeared to be leaking pipes. When I reached where my apartment should be, instead of apartment 4C or suite 47, there was just a boarded up opening with "condemned" spray painted across the plywood. The abandoned version felt different from the others. While the construction zone and hotel corridor had seemed actively inhabited, this version felt genuinely empty and forgotten. There were no sounds coming from behind the boarded doors, no signs of life anywhere in the deteriorating space. When I went back to the stairwell and climbed up again, I found the normal modern hallway and was able to enter my apartment as usual. But the abandoned version left me with an unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake. I've been living with this bizarre situation for 3 weeks now, never knowing which version of my floor I'll encounter when I come home. Sometimes I'll deliberately take the elevator just to avoid the uncertainty of the stairwell. But other times, I find myself curious about which timeline I might access next. Yesterday, I discovered that the phenomenon isn't limited to the 4th floor. When I tried accessing other floors via the stairwell, I occasionally found alternate versions of those hallways too. The 2nd floor sometimes appears as what looks like a 1960s office building with frosted glass doors and vintage furniture visible through the windows. The 6th floor occasionally transforms into what appears to be artist studios with skylights and easels visible through open doorways. It's like the entire building exists in multiple timelines simultaneously, and the stairwell serves as some kind of temporal access point that randomly connects to different versions of the same space. I'm the only resident who seems to experience this, possibly because I'm the only one who regularly uses the stairs instead of the elevator. I've stopped trying to understand why this is happening and started documenting each encounter in a detailed journal. Part of me hopes that eventually I'll find some pattern or logic to the temporal shifts, but mostly I've accepted that I'm living in a building where the past, present, and possible futures all occupy the same physical space, accessible to anyone willing to climb a few flights of stairs and see where they end up. That story is absolutely mind-bending because it takes something as mundane as walking to your apartment and turns it into a journey through time. The idea that a building could exist in multiple timelines simultaneously, accessible through something as simple as taking the stairs instead of the elevator, is both fascinating and terrifying. What really gets me is the condemned version of his floor, like he's seeing a possible future where everything falls apart. I'd probably become obsessed with mapping out all the different versions and trying to find the logic behind when each one appears. Let me close with one final story that brings us full circle to the nature of reality itself. I work as a night janitor at a science museum, and I've always found the job peaceful. There's something calming about walking through empty exhibits in the quiet hours after midnight, surrounded by displays about the natural world and human discovery. I've been working there for 5 years, and I thought I knew every inch of the building until last month, when I discovered that the museum has been teaching me things that shouldn't be possible. The museum has 3 main floors: natural history on the 1st floor, space and astronomy on the 2nd, and physics and technology on the 3rd. My routine takes me through each section systematically, cleaning floors, emptying trash bins, and making sure all the interactive displays are turned off for the night. About 6 weeks ago, I was cleaning the physics section on the 3rd floor when I noticed that one of the displays had changed. It was an exhibit about quantum mechanics that usually featured information about wave-particle duality and electron behavior. But that night, the display showed something completely different: detailed information about parallel universe theory, complete with mathematical equations I'd never seen before. I figured maybe the museum had updated the exhibit, and I just hadn't noticed during previous shifts. Science museums regularly refresh their displays to incorporate new discoveries and research. But when I came in the next night, the display was back to its usual quantum mechanics content. This started happening regularly throughout the museum. Exhibits would show completely different information during my night shifts. then revert to their normal content by morning. The dinosaur display on the first floor would occasionally feature species I'd never heard of, with detailed descriptions of creatures that supposedly lived alongside the familiar dinosaurs, but in evolutionary niches that didn't make sense according to everything I knew about prehistoric life. The astronomy section would sometimes display information about solar systems with impossible configurations, planets orbiting binary stars in ways that should have torn them apart, or galaxies with structures that contradicted basic physics. The exhibits would present these impossible scenarios as established scientific fact, complete with observational data and peer-reviewed research citations. At first, I assumed the museum was testing new educational content, or maybe showcasing speculative science fiction alongside real research. But the information was always presented with the same authoritative tone and professional formatting as the permanent exhibits. I started taking photos of the altered displays to show my supervisor, thinking maybe there was some kind of technical malfunction causing content from other museums or educational databases to appear randomly. But every photo I took showed only the normal exhibit content, even when I was looking directly at completely different information with my own eyes. 3 weeks ago, I decided to read through one of the altered displays more carefully, instead of just glancing at it during my cleaning routine. The physics exhibit was showing information about something called consciousness-dependent reality, explaining how observation doesn't just affect quantum particles, but actually determines the fundamental structure of space-time itself. According to this version of the exhibit, reality exists in a state of constant flux until conscious observation collapses it into a specific configuration. The display included detailed explanations of experiments that proved consciousness could retroactively determine past events, and mathematical formulas showing how individual awareness shapes the physical laws governing their personal experience of the universe. I spent over an hour reading through the entire presentation, taking notes by hand, since photographs wouldn't capture what I was seeing. The information was incredibly detailed and internally consistent, referencing scientific papers and researchers I'd never heard of, but which were presented as foundational figures in physics. The next morning, I looked up some of the researchers and papers mentioned in the exhibit. None of them existed. The scientists had never published any papers, the institutions listed didn't have physics departments, and the experimental results referenced had never been conducted by anyone in the scientific community. But the mathematical formulas I'd copied down were remarkably elegant and internally consistent. When I showed them to a physics professor at the local university, she was intrigued by their sophistication, but confirmed that they described theoretical concepts that were far beyond current scientific understanding. Last week, the museum taught me something that changed everything. I was cleaning the natural history section when I found an exhibit about human evolution that included a detailed timeline of how consciousness developed alongside physical changes in the brain. But this timeline extended far beyond modern humans, describing stages of awareness that humans supposedly achieved in the distant future. According to this exhibit, humans eventually developed the ability to perceive multiple probability states simultaneously, experiencing all possible versions of reality at once until they learned to consciously select which timeline to inhabit. The display explained that some individuals develop this ability earlier than others, often beginning with small glimpses of alternate possibilities before gaining full control over their reality selection process. The exhibit included a detailed description of the symptoms experienced by people beginning to develop this expanded consciousness, seeing places that exist in different timelines, encountering people who remember different versions of shared events, and experiencing temporal displacement, where familiar locations appear to change randomly based on the observer's awareness level. As I read through this information, I realized it was describing exactly what I'd been hearing in all the stories people tell about glitches in reality, the experiences that seem impossible, The encounters with alternate versions of familiar places, the situations where individual perception doesn't match consensus reality. According to this exhibit, these aren't glitches at all. They're signs that human consciousness is beginning to evolve beyond its current limitations, developing the ability to perceive and interact with the multiple probability states that quantum physics suggests exist simultaneously around us at all times. What we interpret as supernatural events or reality malfunctions are actually glimpses of our species' next evolutionary step. The exhibit suggested that these experiences are becoming more common because humanity is approaching a threshold where expanded consciousness becomes the norm rather than the exception. People who experience reality glitches aren't encountering errors in the universe. They're developing enhanced awareness that allows them to see beyond the single timeline that most humans currently perceive as the only reality. When I finished reading, I realized that the museum had been preparing me for this understanding all along. Every altered exhibit had been teaching me about the nature of consciousness, the flexibility of reality, and the possibility that what we consider impossible is simply beyond our current level of awareness. I looked around at all the familiar displays, wondering how many other night shift workers had received these same lessons, and whether the museum itself might be something more than just a repository of human knowledge, perhaps a training ground for minds ready to perceive the true nature of reality. That was the final story. The idea that reality glitches might actually be signs of evolving human consciousness is both comforting and terrifying. It suggests that all these impossible experiences aren't random errors in the universe, but glimpses of something much larger that we're only beginning to understand. Whether that's true or just another layer of the mystery, these stories remind us that reality might be far more flexible than we ever imagined, and that consciousness itself might be the key to understanding why some people get to peek behind the curtain, while others never notice that there's a curtain at all. If you enjoyed this batch of Reddit stories tonight, consider subscribing if you haven't already, as I read Reddit stories just like these every day. Take care and see you tomorrow.